of the budget debate is the appropriation bill. But before the debate commences, the report of the Standing Finance Committee tabled today must be adopted. Therefore, Madam Speaker, I now move that the motion for the adoption of the report of the Standing Finance Committee, notice of which I gave earlier, be approved.
Members, the question is that the motion for the adoption of the report of the Standing Committee be approved. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Over to you now. Yes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, as I was saying, I want to begin by thanking Almighty God for his kindness as well as his blessings and mercy. To God be the glory, great things he has done. Madam Speaker, today, March 8th, is International Women's Day, and I want to join with my colleagues in the House in celebrating the social and the economic and the political achievement, cultural and other achievements of women, and for a call to action for increasing gender parity in Jamaica. Madam Speaker, I'd like to use this occasion to publicly congratulate you, the Deputy Speaker of the House, the Deputy Leader of Government Business, other members of this House. Madam Speaker, we have 18 female leaders, a historical record currently in Parliament, and we are better, stronger, and wiser because of your representation. The colours of International Women's Day are purple, white, and green, and I sought to show my endorsement for International Women's Day by donning a purple coloured tag. To those watching on social media and television, and particularly to members of the diaspora overseas, thank you for your interest and commitment. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to the executives of St. Andrew Northwest, some of whom are here, and particularly hard-working councillors and workers in St. Andrew Northwest who have dedicated themselves to supporting me, supporting the party I represent, and supporting the Jamaican people. Please. Madam Speaker, to my colleagues in Parliament, and particularly my fellow members of Cabinet, thank you for your support, encouragement, and continued sacrifice on behalf of the Jamaican people. And speaking of Parliament, Madam Speaker, I think I have to ask for the bill to be read a second time, which I have. I would not be here without the support and encouragement of the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness. Jamaica is stronger, better, and more prosperous today under his firm and courageous leadership. Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Houses of Parliament who are so gracious and professional in the performance of their duties, as well as members of the media who also play a critical role. Thank you. I want to thank the hardworking and dedicated team at the Ministry of Finance, led by the Financial Secretary, Ms. Darlene Morrison, and as well as the administrative and ancillary staff in my office and the security assigned to me, all who go beyond the call of duty. Madam Speaker, I have a special thanks to my colleague minister in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the Honourable Marshall Smith, who has been an incredible help in the performance of my duties. Thanks to the board, management and staff of the Planning Institute of Jamaica, which is a strong and independent and world-class institution, and all the public institutions within the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. Most of all, Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my family for their incredible patience and understanding. My mother, Mrs. Mary Clarke, my wife, and my children, thank you for the unconditional love and support. Madam Speaker, I begin my remarks today by expressing deepest condolences on behalf of the government of Jamaica for the lives that have been lost and the devastation that has occurred in the Ukraine as a result of recent hostilities in that country. Jamaica has joined with most countries around the world at the United Nations in the in the condemnation of the government of Russia for violating the sovereignty of Ukraine. The Ukraine war represents the most significant conflict and the largest exodus of people in Europe since World War II, over 2 million people to date. I'd like to commend the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Honourable Kamina Johnson-Smith, in ensuring that the Jamaicans in Ukraine were safely evacuated from the country. We are all grateful that they made it out safely. The outcome of both the military assault and the subsequent economic sanctions are uncertain. However, the negative effects on the world, including Jamaica, are already beginning to manifest themselves and could get worse. Madam Speaker, I just have some order business to complete before I continue. I need to move for suspension of the standing orders to enable me to introduce and have read the second time, the Appropriation Act 2022, and to give notice of second reading of the bill, and to commence debate on the motion for second reading.
The question is that the bill be read a first time. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2022.
Madam Clarke, the Minister did ask for the bill to be read a second time. So, members, the question is that the bill be now read by the clerk a second time. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Madam Clarke?
Well, the Appropriation Act 2022 read a first time. Beg to give notice of second reading, Minister.
Madam Speaker, I now move to introduce, I now give notice rather of the second reading of the bill. So, as I was saying, Madam Speaker, there are three economic channels through which this crisis could impact Jamaica. First is the increase in energy and other commodities, including wheat and other grains, and higher commodity prices today means that average inflation for the upcoming fiscal year could be higher than previously anticipated. Second, this inflationary pressure exacerbates recent supply chain disruptions, potentially negatively impacts the COVID rebound by reducing the prospect for global economic growth, which could slow because of this Ukraine crisis. And the third potential source of impact is adverse financial flows as global investors seek safer assets. We are closely monitoring the development and the reaction of markets. Madam Speaker, Jamaica has the wherewithal to withstand this crisis, and we will always ensure that the poor and vulnerable are protected from the worst effects of this crisis. The Jamaican economy is resilient, and we will weather this storm. Now, Jamaica marks 60 years of independence this year. This is a significant milestone which we can all be proud of. We were not supposed to get this far. It was the late Michael Manley who described our journey as up the down escalator. But the Jamaican people have defied the odds and survived and flourished, and we have influenced the world. We have given birth to a globally celebrated culture. Jamaican music is played and imitated in all corners of the world. Jamaica's contribution to humanity includes a globally recognized philosophical outlook and religion based on unity, based on peace, based on tolerance and love. Our cuisine is enjoyed across all countries. The international achievements of our sportsmen and sportswomen defy our small size. Most importantly, Madam Speaker, Jamaica has shown the capacity to self-correct, to innovate and to improve. The surest sign of the health of any organism is its capacity to heal and to grow. The great designer who shaped us perfectly in his image designed as such that a cut on the arm is attended to by a throng of white blood cells that begin the healing process. And we, our little country, has shown that capacity for self-healing and innovation and growth and transformation of, for example, our electoral system that was one of the most violently corrupt and unreliable to becoming a dependable beacon of freedom in the world. This progress, Madam Speaker, provides substance for hope, because with all of our achievements, there's one significant area in which Jamaica has lagged the world, and that is in economic improvement. A country's most used measure of economic advancement is the amount of goods and services that that country produces each year, and how this quantity changes over time. Gross domestic product is the metric that best captures this. And we can look at gross domestic product divided by the number of people in the population, that's GDP per capita, to get a sense of average economic output per person or average income. We can back out inflationary effects to get a sense of how our average income in real terms has changed over time. When you examine, Madam Speaker, Jamaica's GDP per capita in real terms over 60 years, it's easy to see that we have meandered in the economic wilderness for well over 40 years. In fact, Madam Speaker, the IMF recently completed a health checkup on Jamaica, which is called an Article 4 consultation, which was published in February of 2022. The very, very first paragraph of that 100-page document reads as follows. Real GDP per capita is lower today than it was in 1970, partly the result of repeated fiscal balance of payments or banking crises. The very first paragraph. This, Madam Speaker, is a sad and shocking reality. I'm putting up here a graph from that report, the Article 4 consultation of Jamaica, that shows how our average income in real terms has fluctuated over time, and it's lower today than 50 years ago. Just look at that diagram for a second. The Jamaican economy, and here we're talking about economic history. Clearly our history is broader than economic. I just spoke about many other aspects of our history. The Jamaican economy experienced a rapid and sustained expansion in the 1960s, where real per capita GDP grew by 50% over the period 1962 to 1972. And by the way, this is the exact chart in the IMF Article 4 consultation. It's an index of real GDP set in 1972 at 100. But critics say the benefits from the 62 to 72 expansion were not equally distributed. However, the economic gains were largely erased in the decade that followed. Real per capita GDP plummeted by 40% between 1972 and 1980, even as social and economic programs were greatly expanded. The Article 4 consultation notes the fiscal deficit widened to 15% of GDP as government spending climbed from 23% of GDP in 1972 to an unsustainable 45% in 1978. These deficits were financed by foreign loans and central bank borrowing, i.e. the printing of money. Now, structural adjustment followed in the early 1980s and involved a reduction in unsustainable expenditure and a sharp devaluation of our currency that helped to stabilize the economy. However, much of the debt was foreign, and Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio soared. Real per capita GDP bottomed out in 1986 after showing some encouraging signs of rebound before that, and it dropped to 20% lower than we were in 1963. And then Jamaica registered a second period of high real per capita GDP growth. From this low point in 1986, real per capita GDP grew by 90% between 1987 and 1994, including a period of very high growth in 1987, 89, 1990, and then tapering off with some lower growth, but still consistent growth between 1991 to 1994. We tend to forget about this period, 87 to 94, because of what happened after. Madam Speaker, but even at the end of this second growth spurt, real per capita GDP was still lower than 1972. Liberalization of the financial sector without a strong regulatory and supervisory framework, among other factors, contributed to a monumental fiscal crisis that came after. The intervention cost 40% of GDP, and we know the rest. Our debt skyrocketed. By 2013, it was 146% of GDP, and interest consumed an unsustainable part of government revenues. Real per capita GDP stagnated during some of this time, but was showing signs of recovery before the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Once the data of 2021 is added, we'll show a strong uptick from where the graph ends. But the point of this, Madam Speaker, is just to share that the real per capita GDP, the real average income of Jamaicans, is lower today, approximately 20% lower than it was 50 years ago. Madam Speaker, my fellow parliamentarians, my fellow Jamaicans, we need to be mindful of this history and resolve ourselves that this record, this dismal economic record, is never repeated. The next 50 years cannot be like the past 50 as far as our economy is concerned. Now, we know this story anecdotally, but when we hear it with comparisons to Singapore, we often dismiss it with a nonchalant, them different from we. Don't tell me about Singapore, them different from me. Well, let's look on how our fellow brothers and sisters in the Caribbean fared over the last 50 years. And again, this is data from the IMF. When you compare the same metric, change in real per capita GDP, with our Caribbean neighbors, the contrast is staggering. For the first 10 years after independence in 1962, Jamaica's increase in real per capita GDP tracked closely with that of Barbados. However, Barbados continued on that track of increasing real per capita GDP over 4 decades, while Jamaica did not. Today, despite pronounced reversals of these gains in Barbados since 2008, Barbados' real per capita GDP, according to the figures from the IMF, are still 20% higher today than in 1972, unlike Jamaica, where we're 20% behind. Let's look at St. Lucia, and I could go and look at all of it, but I just look at these 2 Caribbean countries. St. Lucia, again, while, you can't see the yellow, huh? Easily. While the first 10 years, again, were very similar in terms of the increase in average per capita GDP, we diverged after the first 10 years, and today St. Lucia's real per capita GDP is 3.5 times what it was in 1972, 350% of what they had in 1972, whereas Jamaica is 20% less than where we were in 1972. We have to internalize this economic history as a people if we are not to repeat it. Now, this brief comparative comparison wouldn't be complete without the proverbial Singapore. So let's put it up there, right? Singapore, whereas St. Lucia did 3.5 times, Singapore did 12 times, right? That's 1,200% in real per capita GDP since 1972, whereas Jamaica is 20% lower. Again, now, per capita GDP is not the perfect measure for well-being, but at a minimum, it describes economic resources available to a country each year, which is a universally recognized proxy for average income. And there's no avoiding the fact that Jamaica's economic experience compares dismally with our peer countries over the 50-year horizon. From an economic perspective, as compared to other countries, it is as if Jamaica wandered through the wilderness for much of that time. The clearest way to characterize our economic journey has been chronic instability and fiscal unsustainability, falling into crisis and taking forever to recover. In fact, when you look at the history of fiscal deficits, it's quite alarming. The enduring lesson from all of this, Madam Speaker, across countries, is that fiscal, balance of payment and banking crises are enormously costly and damaging. And that is why during the COVID crisis, we did everything we could to avoid fiscal or balance of payment crisis. And 60 years of independence bears that truth. These crises have and can still have, if we are not careful, can set our country back for decades, for generations, while other countries zoom past us. Most of the Eastern Caribbean has per capita GDPs way in excess of where we are, and it wasn't necessarily like that at the start. These crises, Madam Speaker, unless we manage the finances of our economy well and create a policy environment that creates stability and supports growth, we can make the same mistakes again. So the most important lesson is that in all that we do, we should never, ever sacrifice discipline or policy sustainability or economic resilience for short-term expediency. Now, Madam Speaker, this cannot be the burden of the government or the Minister of Finance alone. This has to be a shared national awareness and shared responsibility across all institutions, all ministries, all segments of the population, public and private sectors, and across all party lines. From our history, we also know that economic shocks over which we have no control, such as commodity price increases, geopolitical tensions, and natural disasters, can precipitate or worsen fiscal or balance of payment crises. Another important lesson, therefore, is that we must remain committed to preserving economic stability while we build and maintain fiscal buffers, such as low fiscal balances, responsible fiscal balances, low debt, contingency funds, and monetary buffers such as adequate foreign exchange reserves. These buffers provide the policy flexibility to allow for a responsible and effective response to crises, as well as a likelihood of quick economic recoveries, just as happened with the COVID-19 crisis and the recovery so far from COVID-19. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to say that this government understands and has learned these critical lessons from history, and we remain firmly committed to making sound, sustainable policy decisions that strengthen our economic resilience and ensure that when faced with unseen external shocks, we are ready and prepared to address and overcome them with a focus on the poor and vulnerable. Now, Madam Speaker, over the past year, the Jamaican economy has begun an impressive recovery from the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Across several metrics, such as economic growth, job growth, debt reduction, credit ratings, you name it, the Jamaican economy has been recovering from the COVID-19 well ahead of most of our peers. Let me remind you, my members, that when we gathered here last year, some people never believed that we could recover this fast. Never believed. When we forecasted 5% growth, then question it. No, I don't blame them, because this kind of economic recovery we've experienced over the last year, we have never experienced before. So how can they have seen it? It is difficult to see and recognize what you have never experienced. Now, while other economies in our region wobbled in the last fiscal year, Jamaica staged a strong, robust, and historic recovery, and that was no accident. With the blessings of God Almighty and good policy choices, the historic shock delivered by the pandemic did not, as in the past, lead to a debt crisis, did not, as in the past, lead to a fiscal crisis, did not, as in the past, lead to a balance of payments crisis, and any of these knock-on effects would have greatly prolonged our recovery. Instead, the Jamaican economy came roaring back with 14% growth in the first quarter of the fiscal year, the highest quarterly growth ever recorded in Jamaica, albeit from a decline the previous year before, and a historic decline. 5.8% growth in the second quarter of the fiscal year, a projected 6% growth in the third quarter of the fiscal year, and a projected 7 to 9%, they never believe it, for 2021-22. And, Madam Speaker, the dance them no start yet. Desmond, wedding a rollout yet? No, Prime Minister, I know that you're working on something for the entertainment sector, but don't take too long, PM, because I want them to come out. Because when we have a dance, when we have a round robin, when we have cake sale and fish fry, a whole heap of people benefit. We're talking about Cane Man. We're talking about Soupy. We're talking about Nutsy, I'm calling Nutsy. Madam Speaker, all Keisha. Look at her, man. Madam Speaker, Keisha. Wait, no, man. No, not that Keisha. But Keisha get her partner draw. Keisha borrow a igloo. Buy some ice and put some lick on top of the igloo. Is Keisha weekend dinner that? And so when Brogard busts all them people there, is that time you're gonna see economic recovery? No, Madam Speaker. Some will say that there was great policy coordination across major economies of the world, and that coordination helped, but it cannot be considered the major factor for country experiences because there's great divergence in economic recovery across countries of the world. And for those who wonder about whether the economy's decline in 2020 is the explanatory factor that explains the rapid growth in 2021, I ask, why didn't we grow in 1997 after the economy declined by 6.7% in 1976? Why didn't we grow in 1986 after a decline of 4.5% in 1985? Why didn't we grow in 2010 after 3.2% decline in 2009? In our economic history, economic decline is usually followed by further decline, Madam Speaker. Together, we as a Jamaican society, we, all of us, opposition included, all of us, we broke this cycle this time. And hopefully we have established a template for the future. Among other factors, our economic recovery benefited from fiscal buffers. We increased cash cushions through privatizations, integration of public bodies, targeted fiscal overperformance. We are fortunate to have had $70-odd billion in cash deposits that we could deploy. We had monetary buffers. We took the strategic decision to increase non-borrowed reserves with exchange rate flexibility. Non-borrowed reserves increased by $1 billion between 2016 and 2019. I don't want us to forget these things. We had resilience buffers. We put away resources in 2018 and 2019. And you cooperated with me on that in disaster funds, that we were able to draw down on those funds in the first few months of the pandemic. We capitalized the central bank, took the strategic decision to capitalize by $20 billion, which allowed it to have in 2018 and 19, and allowed them to pump unprecedented liquidity into the banking system. And second, Madam Speaker, we made sustainable and internally consistent policy choices during the crisis, not all of them popular. And we had the discipline to reject ideas that fell outside of those criteria, lots of those. As a result, our economic recovery in Jamaica has been faster and stronger than the vast majority of our peers in the Caribbean. Quite a few had the unfortunate experience of a second year of economic decline in 2021. So you look at this graph here, Jamaica is fourth from the left. And this is calendar year 2020 and calendar year 2021, where you'll see that we all declined last year, and some of us, at least 1, 2, 3, and I believe there's a fourth one that's not here, declined again for the second year. And Jamaica's growth coming out so far is the second among all these countries here in the Caribbean, all of whom experience declines. And if decline lead to recovery, then you would see recovery being higher for those who decline more. It's also, so Madam Speaker, that is something for us too. It's not many times that Jamaica has been in this position out of a crisis that we all faced, for Jamaica to be leading the Caribbean pack, so to speak. It's also worth noting, Madam Speaker, I have to make mention, is that the construction industry grew throughout the pandemic. That was exceptional. That apart from the very, very, very first quarter where everything was shut down, we had consistent growth, even with with severe restrictions, and that is a big part of our recovery and of the job growth that we have had. It's also worth noting that after a dreadful and painful 2020, the tourism sector returned with a bang, growing over 300% in the second quarter of 2021. Take a bow, Minister Bartlett, take a bow. There's still, however, much more recovery necessary. And it's also worth noting that for the last 3 quarters of 2021-22, all sectors of the economy recovered strongly and grew, with the exception of mining. And the reasons for mining's decline are well understood. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to report that one thing is growth, economic growth. The other thing is that we experienced job growth. Between July 2020 and July 2021, there were 100,000 new jobs. Many of them jobs that people had before, but sometimes somebody was laid off from a call center and ended up in a job in a restaurant. But 100,000 jobs. And between October 2020 and October 2021, 75,000 jobs. In fact, Madam Speaker, the unemployment rate fell to the lowest level in Jamaica's history at 7.1%, curiously even lower than the pre-pandemic level. Now, the labour force participation rate was slightly smaller because a lot of people, some people stayed home taking care of kids who could not go to school. So some people were absent from the labour market. But nonetheless, to go back down to 7.1%, even before the recovery is complete, is something that I think Jamaicans can all be proud of. Now, there are those who will try to undermine job growth and belittle hardworking people, but let me tell you, every one of those 100,000 families that benefited from this recovery, they know the value of a stable government with good policies. Because they have income again. They are independent again. Every one of those 100,000 people who are at home now have income, and they appreciate the strong recovery. Of course, we want an economy with higher paying jobs, but I show you the graph of Singapore's economic growth. They started with textile jobs in the 1960s, then they graduated in the 70s and graduated by having sustainable policy choices over a long period of time, and today they are where they are. You have to use what you have to get to where you want to go. So, Madam Speaker, we too will use what we have. We won't curse it. And we'll use what we have to get to where we want to go. We will recover, Madam Speaker, and we are ready and prepared to bring people back to work. Now, Madam Speaker, the debt ratio, which is an important ratio for Jamaica, given the amount of resources that it takes to service our debt. The debt ratio was 94% approximately in March 2020. And due to the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on growth, even though we didn't borrow very much during the crisis, the GDP, the debt ratio shot up to 110% by March 2021. Now, for Jamaica, given our vulnerabilities, this was a high and risky level of debt, as I articulated in my budget presentation last year. If we were caught with this level of debt now and war broke out in Ukraine, it would be a different kettle of fish. A year later, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to report and thankful that along with strong GDP growth and strong jobs growth, we also have significantly reduced our debt to GDP ratio, which is now projected to be in the region of 96% by March of 2022. And with God's help, barring any major surprises and massive exogenous setbacks, by the end of the upcoming fiscal year, we could see this ratio go below 90%, which will be the first time in 23 years, an entire generation, Madam Speaker. So the debt to GDP ratio shot up dramatically, and 2 years later, we're projected to recover almost to our pre-COVID levels. Now, there's a chart, Madam Speaker, in the IMF's 2021 Article 4 consultation on Jamaica, which I've reproduced here, and it's very instructive. The countries are on the bottom, and it has all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, or most of them. And on the vertical axis, it has the percentage of points change in GDP as compared to pre-pandemic. Jamaica is a red button there. You can see we were 94 pre-pandemic, and we went up all the way up, 110, and we come back to 96. So we are 2 points behind where we were. But when you look at the rest of the region, you see that, first of all, Jamaica is second among 30 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in restoring the national debt level, the debt to GDP level, to almost pre-COVID levels. When you look at all of the other, thank you, sir. So Jamaica is right here, right? Our change between 2019 and 2021, 2%, 2 percentage points. When you look at the rest of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Some of them, their change is same 2 years, 60 points of GDP, 45 points of GDP, 30 points of GDP, 25 points of GDP, 15 points of GDP, even now. And these are all in our neighborhood, Caribbean, Central America, and Latin America. So when we say that Jamaica is doing well, Madam Speaker, look at this chart. Look at it. It don't mean that everything is hunky-dory, but I'm showing you that things are a lot worse in other countries. And this is due to the administration of Prime Minister Andrew Holness and the policies that we have put in place. Now, this, Madam Speaker, I want to say this is, government is in place, government is responsible for leadership, but this is our collective achievement. Jamaica's achievement. It lowers the risk of the Jamaican economy and provides better protection for turbulence. And God knows that Jamaica experiences external turbulence. So, but let's not get carried away, Madam Speaker, because they don't have access to international markets. We are not yet out of the woods by any means. Due to, even at the 96%, we're still higher than a lot of countries. With God's help, due to the high debt levels that now prevail around the world, we're likely to see a debt crisis emerge globally and even in the Western Hemisphere. With God's help, we'll steer clear of that so we can recover and restore. And we can continue to build an economy where real per capita GDP, real average income, increases steadily over time. Now, Madam Speaker, the balance of payment data across the region is even more frightening. Jamaica achieved a healthy balance of payment position of 2% of GDP last year, which was miles away from where the rest of our peers in the Caribbean ended up. So this is essentially your foreign exchange position for your country. We ended up at 2% of GDP, negative 2% of GDP in terms of what the balance was at the end of the year. And the rest of the region had balance of payments deficits, 10%, 15%, 20%, 30%, Madam Speaker. Just another indicator. Now, the recovery, Madam Speaker, benefited from social and economic support and health expenditure provided during the pandemic. The government delivered direct and indirect support across 2 fiscal years as a response to the pandemic, costing $40.6 billion and representing 2% of GDP. In Jamaica, where 16% of GDP goes to interest and wages and salaries, which are non-discretionary expenditures and can't easily be changed, as compared to other, and much higher, much higher, as you'll see later, than other countries in our region, where that 16% is like 8 or 12, finding 2% of GDP in a crisis and remaining fiscally sound is a big deal. As we emerge from the worst of the pandemic, it is critically important that we take stock, Madam Speaker. So one of the things that we did, we cut the GCT, which cost $14 billion. We introduced set cash for Jamaicans who lost their job during COVID, who are on PAYE and ended up getting $18,000 a month for 13 months across 2 fiscal years. 40,000 Jamaicans benefited, and it cost $7.9 billion. We had the best cash program, where we paid hotels to keep employees. They kept 15,000 employees who we paid, 167 hotels. And we paid them for 13 months across 2 fiscal years, and that cost $4.1 billion. In 2020, we had compassionate grant, which needs no explanation. 390,000 people benefited, and that cost $3.9 billion. We had a general grants, 20,000 people benefited, 19,086, $662 million. We had a tourism grants, where 85 hotels were able to receive grants of between $1 million, because they were completely shut down with no revenues and had all these maintenance costs, between $1 million and $5 million, for a total of $266 million. 1,700 small businesses received grants of $100,000 each, or for $152 million. We had a special grant for PATH in the early months of the pandemic that cost $1.1 billion. We had a back-to-school grant in the summer months of 2020, where $8,500 per student on PATH. There were 203,000 students on PATH that received these grants for a total cost of $1.8 billion. We had care food packages in that year of $339 million. Farmers and fishermen, $1 billion. The COVID-19 vaccine incentive in this fiscal year, which has had some teething pains because the initial vaccine records were not electronic, and therefore the verification has in some cases been delayed, and we can't pay out unless it's verified. But so far, 48,769 Jamaicans have been confirmed and will have received $488 million in grants. We have the workers' grant, where 42,000 Jamaicans will receive grants of $10,000, and these are Jamaicans who earn less than $15,000 a week, and that costs $427 million. We introduced the NIS pensioners grant, where 57,000 Jamaicans who had pensions, NIS pensions less than $15,000 a month, received $570 million. We had another PATH grant in 21-22, where 130,000 PATH beneficiaries received grants of $10,000 each, 130,000 for $1.3 billion. 5,000 social pensioners, and this is through the Ministry of Labour and Social Security. 5,000 social pensioners received a combined $50 million. 20,000 taxi operators received grants in the form of paying license fees. 5,000 contract carriage and 15,000 route taxis, for a total of $125 million. Independent school teachers, 1,123 of them, grants totaling $44 million. The Ministry of Culture, Entertainment, Gender and Sports gave out grants of totaling $90 million for entertainers and athletes. Through this Constituency Development Fund and through the Ministry of Local Government, MPs and councillors, $448 million in care packages throughout the year. Poor relief had $330 million. Farmers and fishermen, $1 billion. When you tabulate it all, Madam Speaker, where there were individual grants, there were over 1 million individual grants, Madam Speaker, 1 million individual grants. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them unique. That cost a total, the total including the revenue measure, $40 billion, 1 million individual grants to the people of Jamaica during this COVID crisis so far. In addition, we had temporary waivers of SCT and spectrum fees to facilitate the response, and measures taken by the NHT and the Student Loans Bureau. Madam Speaker, the health sector also benefited from support. 2.1 billion in March 2020, the third supplementary estimate. And in 2020-21, 6 billion in the first supplementary, 1.5 billion in the second, 0.5 in March 2021, and in this fiscal year, $6 billion in the original budget and 10.3 billion in the first supplementary estimates. The direct COVID-19 health intervention in terms of additional support, there was support in the ministry already, but additional support cost $26.4 billion, Madam Speaker. It's important that we put these numbers on the table, not for praise, but these are taxpayer funds. It's important that we aggregate them and let the people of Jamaica know how much we have put behind this effort. Now, Madam Speaker, by all accounts, Jamaica is on a solid path of economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and leading the way in the Caribbean. However, these are not easy times. These are unprecedented and unpredictable times. In January 2022, the United States recorded the highest inflation rate in 40 years. U.S. inflation was 7.5% in the United States. Now, all countries in our region, all countries in this hemisphere, and indeed all countries around the world are experiencing record levels of inflation. And Jamaica is no exception. The inflation rate in January was 9.7%, the highest level in approximately 8 years. The origins of this inflation, Madam Speaker, are global in nature. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a convoluted and distortionary negative impact on global supply chains, which has resulted in rising global commodity and shipping prices. Price of wheat and oil and corn and soybeans and other commodities have been elevated, and the price of shipping containers has skyrocketed. And these have unleashed a chain reaction of other price increases. And commodities are at the base of the production chain. So when commodity prices rise, this results in an upward pressure on the prices of many other goods. We have been experiencing that in Jamaica. Prices of food items have been rising, and in some cases, food prices have risen above the headline inflation rate. Most recently, the price of oil has risen to multi-year highs, highest price in 10 years. Rising food prices, rising oil prices create discontent, and no one likes inflation. This government, Madam Speaker, will continue to protect the most vulnerable. Jamaica is not promised a life without challenges. However, one cannot solve a problem by creating another problem. You can't solve a problem by creating another problem. And as we know from our history, unsustainable policies, no matter how well-intentioned, often lead to ruin. The next 50 years cannot be like the last 50 from our economic history point of view. As such, even in challenging times, we have to maintain prudency, but resolve to act and protect the most vulnerable and those at risk. So let me tell you what we're doing today in March. This month, in March 2022, the Ministry of Labour and Social Security plans to expand its reach to include needy families who are not in receipt of the PATH grants. Through the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, the Government of Jamaica is partnering with the Jamaica Red Cross, Food for the Poor, the Council of Voluntary Social Services, Adventist Relief Association, and several other non-governmental organizations to identify persons in need who are not on the PATH program. And we are putting $200 million behind that initiative in the month of March to be spent over the next 3 weeks in response to what is being experienced. Qualified families are set to receive a one-off grant of $10,000 to assist in covering food expenses. This, Madam Speaker, is immediate. It is right now. In April, Madam Speaker, we'll continue this intervention with a further $250 million in support for care packages to the most vulnerable Jamaicans through the Constituency Development Fund, $3 million per Member of Parliament, and the balance through the Ministry of Local Government for municipalities. we have made provisions to be in a position to follow up with another 250 million later in the year, depending on how the situation evolves, Madam Speaker. As a longer-term measure, this government will work towards improving Jamaica's food security. Grow what we eat and eat what we grow. Food security is critical for Jamaica. In everything, you have to have a tactical response and a longer-term strategic response. Former Prime Minister, the Honourable Bruce Golding, whose government also provided during a period of immense crisis, championed increasing Jamaica's food security. This is a Jamaica Labour Party issue. The Prime Minister and Minister Pernell Charles will likely speak about this in their presentations. So, Madam Speaker, as we recover, the important thing to note is that there are few countries who are recovering economically in terms of their GDP production, recovering job growth at the same time, and at the same time reducing debt. It's one thing to do one of those three, but for all three to happen is indeed, I put it to you, quite unique in our hemisphere at this point in time. So as we recover, we want to recover better than before, and to do that, we have to pursue reform with ambition. And the purpose of the
Minister's time for speaking has expired.
Madam Speaker, I beg to move that the Minister's time be extended sufficiently to allow him to conclude his presentation.
Minister, the question before the House is that you be given sufficient time to complete your presentation and leave space for Zozo this evening.
So
those in favor? Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
The purpose of the reform agenda, Madam Speaker, is to improve efficiency, transparency and fairness while providing the framework to accelerate economic growth and development. Madam Speaker, the government will repeal and replace the decades-old Customs Act with a modern Customs Act that's consistent with international best practice. The 800-page bill to repeal and replace the old Customs Act has been before a joint select committee of Parliament, and I've been privileged to work with my opposition counterparts on that committee, and I'm happy to update this House that the work of the Joint Select Committee is substantially completed and the report is now being finalized. Assuming parliamentary approval, we will have a brand new customs regime in the next fiscal year. Madam Speaker, we're working on a fundamental update to Jamaica's tax architecture. Clear and coherent laws capable of easy administration are integral to investment decisions and to providing a predictable business environment. As mentioned in my address last year, the Income Tax Act is being revised. This law has been amended in an ad hoc fashion over time, resulting in some amount of incoherence and difficulty in administration. In addition, Jamaica has signed several international tax treaties, but these treaty obligations are not incorporated into domestic law. The review of the Income Tax Act will be advanced during the year. The Large-Scale Project and Pioneer Industry Act, Madam Speaker, was passed in 2014 to implement a new standard with respect to the treatment of fiscal incentives, where the preference is for the utilization of a more responsible and transparent approach to tax expenditures and the use of targeted tax credits rather than wholesale tax holidays. As we aim to attract larger US billion-dollar investments, it is imperative that we do so within prescribed structures, which will ultimately safeguard our economic sustainability. In view of this, the Act is intended to undergo a series of amendments which seek to create a coherent and self-contained legislative framework for granting fiscal incentives in respect of large qualifying projects in a rules-based and transparent manner. We will table this legislation in the upcoming fiscal year. Madam Speaker, the policy predicate, we want a simpler tax system, and nowhere is our tax system more complicated that affects the ease of doing business as when it comes to the taxation on individuals, statutory deductions and otherwise. Madam Speaker, it should be noted that what the tax reform for the amalgamation of payroll statutory deductions has been a long-standing one in a process started from 2007, and advances have been made along the way. We propose to table legislation in the upcoming fiscal year that can see a consolidation of 4 separate statutory deductions into a single statutory deduction, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is proposed that all sanctions in various tax legislation be put in one uniform sanctions code to facilitate the ease of access by taxpayers and administrators. We have received assistance from the World Bank in the design of this code with the intention that the House will have sight of the bill towards the end of the fiscal year. Madam Speaker, Jamaica is signatory to a global treaty to automatically exchange financial information across jurisdictions to increase efficiency in international tax cooperation and promote a fairer system. Legislative amendments were passed to this effect in this House in 2020, and just as a reminder, they are to take effect in 2022. So effective May 2022, financial institutions will be required to submit information to Tax Administration Jamaica, and exchanges of information with relevant jurisdictions will begin in September 2022. Madam Speaker, a search committee has been established to identify a suitable candidate to lead Jamaica's Fiscal Commission. The search committee is led by Dr. Calvin MacDonald, a Jamaican economist who was recently retired as Deputy Secretary to the IMF. We expect the fiscal, this is the identification process, to have a list of candidates that the respective appointing authority, which is the Governor General, on advice, can carry out that responsibility. We expect the Fiscal Commissioner to be appointed in the upcoming fiscal year, and the selected candidate will lead the establishment of that office, which obviously will take beyond this fiscal year to actually get it up and running. The Fiscal Commission will be the guardian of Jamaica's fiscal rules and will assist in nurturing an environment that's conducive to responsible fiscal policy. Madam Speaker, in a democratic society, public trust is the only currency we have. Our institutional arrangements must always be designed to foster and increase public trust. The greater the public trust that exists, the more a government can do in the interest of its people. One institution whose existence is particularly critical to public trust is the Office of the Auditor General. In a free and democratic society, the role of the Supreme Audit Institution is crucial, which is why that institution is embedded in our Constitution, reports only to Parliament, has independence, security of tenure, and other institutional structures to protect the integrity of that office. One activity that increases public trust is timely annual audits. The Auditor General is responsible for the audit of financial statements prepared by municipal corporations of Jamaica. So we are taking steps, Madam Speaker, to bring a bill to Parliament to address that, to allow you to take your pension with you when you change your job. We're also going to address, Madam Speaker, the intolerable length of time that it takes for people to qualify for pensions. Some companies have a 10-year waiting period, 15-year waiting period. We're going to mandate that the maximum period before you become vested for pension is no longer than 5 years, Madam Speaker. We're going to increase pension participation in Jamaica. In addition to the social benefits, pension funds will become longer-term focused as the frequency of refunds will decline. Now, while we're recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot forget the lessons we have learned. In the global financial crisis, we lost 100,000 jobs over 4 years. In 2020, we lost 150,000 jobs over 4 months. We had no pre-existing institutional mechanisms with which to respond, and we had to improvise, build from scratch. Within weeks, the CARE online system was launched, accessible by computer, tablet, or mobile phone. Eventually, we had 55,000 people, Jamaicans, through the Set Cash and Best Cash programs who received monthly stipends of $18,000 a month, Madam Speaker. And this experience exposed a glaring gap in our social security arrangements. Consistent with the recommendation of the COVID Economic Task Force, the Ministry of Finance and Public Service, through the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and with the technical and financial support of the International Labour Organization, and with the guidance of a technical oversight committee, we have embarked on a feasibility study for the unemployment insurance in Jamaica, started in May 2021. Now, unemployment insurance has many fathers. When you read the debates of the national insurance scheme in the 1960s, it was very clear that members on both sides intended for unemployment insurance to follow the pension after NIS was created. In the late 2010s, we had the Labour Reform Commission that also recommended unemployment insurance. Now, we're not alone. Within CARICOM, only Barbados and Bahamas had pre-existing unemployment insurance schemes before the pandemic. And so with them, they had pre-existing funds they're able to tap into for the COVID relief, and then they tapped up those funds with stuff from the Consolidated Fund. We just had the Consol Fund. But due to the exposure of this weakness, my understanding is that several countries in the Caribbean region are exploring unemployment insurance schemes with the ILO. In Jamaica, we've completed the first 2 or 3 phases of the feasibility study, and we have taken several consultation exercises with trade unions, employers, and government entities. The third and final stage is to commence this month and entail the design of a potential legal and operational framework and a roadmap for implementation. And the study will be completed by June 2022. We'll take the findings to Cabinet for a decision, and then we take it from there, Madam Speaker. Now, unemployment insurance would fundamentally change the social security landscape in Jamaica. And strengthening social security has been an indelible feature of the Andrew Holness government. Madam Speaker, it was this government that, Madam Speaker, the Ministry of Finance, working with former Minister Shahini Robinson, did the policy development for the social pension. And Minister Samuda is leading implementation today, and we have 7,000 social pensioners who now receive a monthly stipend and who have no other source of income. Social pension from this government, Madam Speaker. We have the Tourism Workers Scheme, an initiative that benefited from Minister Bartlett's stewardship, which is another social security initiative introduced by this government, Madam Speaker. And we're working towards, Madam Speaker, even though there's a lot of consultation, unemployment insurance for all working Jamaicans. We believe, Madam Speaker, in recovery, in reform, and in restoration. Madam Speaker, we need to engage in a substantive Madam Speaker, policy discourse on banking and banking fees in Jamaica. This is a source of agitation in our society. There's a feeling and a reality that bank fees are too high for too many people, especially those least able to afford them. There's also the sense that banks are insensitive to their pricing and how these prices are communicated. I want to empower you with knowledge and preserve for you freedom and choice. With greater knowledge comes freedom and choice. Let's start with a foundational principle that a healthy economy needs strong, well-run financial institutions, and in particular, deposit-taking institutions such as banks. A weak or failing banking sector exposes an economy to financial instability, which can be very costly. Madam Speaker, it will end up costing approximately 30 years, more than a generation, for Jamaica to work off and to pay off the massive national debt incurred from the 1990s banking sector crisis. Now, retail banking, Madam Speaker, in Jamaica, retail banking is not as profitable as many believe. Firstly, many retail banks are part of larger financial groups and contribute, in some cases, a third, in some cases 25%, in some cases 35%, of the overall profits of those financial groups. So when you hear the group has made a profit of X, the retail bank with the branches sometimes contributes 25% of that, a quarter of that, or 30%, as the case may be. In addition, the average return on equity for deposit-taking institutions, retail banks, at the end of 2020 was 9.4%. It's on the Bank of Jamaica website. You can see it in IMF Article 4 consultation as well, which is lower than many other industries in Jamaica. Third, bank branch networks in Jamaica are very expensive to maintain, with most banks reducing rather than opening new branches. And while you see many people rushing into industries such as property development or retail, there are few that are lining up to open retail banks. And that tells you something. Fourth, retail banks pay, and other financial sector entities pay much higher taxes than many other sectors of the economy. They pay corporate income tax of 33.33%, which is a third higher than other companies in the Jamaican economy, apart from regulated companies. And on top of that, there's a very counterproductive, and here the government is just owning up on this, right? There's a very counterproductive asset tax, where the government imposes a tax every time a bank provides a customer with a loan. In fact, taxes can represent 50% or more of a retail bank's pre-tax operating profits. Now, you're not going to see that on our income statement because not all of the taxes are charged, not all of the taxes charged by government are levied or assessed on income. But when you add them up, they represent, in some cases, 50% of operating profits. Now, this heavy taxation contributes to the high cost structure of retail banking. And it's not something we can change overnight, because the revenues generated are so high and so important to the government's functioning, and alternatives to that revenue are few. Now, in 2020, I announced a partial reduction in the asset tax for financial institutions on condition that is passed on to consumers. And we had to reverse that decision in the pandemic because of the decimation of government revenues. We will revisit it as soon as we are able to. In addition, Madam Speaker, Jamaica has a huge problem with crime, resulting in a disproportionate high security cost to the economy generally, but it is particularly pernicious when it comes to financial institutions. Check fraud is extremely high, and I was talking reality with the Jamaican people. Check fraud is extremely high in Jamaica, and many banks no longer cash checks in their branches as a result, and this is an inconvenience. The scamming of credit and debit cards is also high, and, Madam Speaker, a phenomenon that we have here in Jamaica, and here we're talking the Jamaican family, a phenomenon that we have here in Jamaica, which is less pronounced in other Caribbean countries, is the wholesale theft of ATMs, something that's unreported, right? Where people go and dig out in the dead of night the entire ATM and go away with it. It imposes a cost where people have to hire. This is a reality. It happens. And I'm mentioning it here because I think it's time for us to be completely transparent about what is happening. It's not something that you like to admit, but it is true. Now, moving cash as a result of is particularly expensive because of the high levels of crime and the cost of insurance. And there's a fair amount of illegal cash in Jamaica. All you have to do is see the houses that start and don't finish. Well, let's not cast aspersions, but we all know anecdotally when some of them finish. And there's a fair amount of illegal foreign cash. And Jamaica has been placed on a special international watch list, right, because of the heightened risk of money laundering. So banks are therefore forced to implement special compliance mechanisms that are costly to administer to ensure that illegal cash does not infiltrate the banking system. In fact, Madam Speaker, over the last few years, Madam Speaker, something again that is in the public domain but we don't often talk about, over the past few years, Jamaica has only had one correspondent bank that accepts U.S. cash from Jamaican banks. One. Most correspondent banks deem Jamaica too risky. As a result, the banks price their purchasing of U.S. dollars at a low level that people commonly believe is because of rapacious intent. The reason, Madam Speaker, is that they don't really want the U.S. dollars cash because of the compliance risks. If we lose that one correspondent banking relationship on cash, by the way, we have several correspondent banking relationships when it comes to wires. When it comes to U.S. cash, all U.S. cash that you find in Jamaica has to be taken and exported. There's one bank willing to accept it overseas. And because of that, Madam Speaker, so we end up how crime and criminality has an economic impact. Now, I'm not saying this as an excuse. I'm just saying this as reality, that we need to understand and construct our solutions with knowledge of this reality. Now, banks have responded to the cost structure of retail banking by encouraging banking customers out of banking halls and charging more for in-branch transactions. And that strategy is such now that in-branch transactions only account for 4% of total banking transactions in Jamaica today. 4%. The rest of them are online, at ATMs, over the mobile phone, etc. Now, Madam Speaker, having said all of that, have there been issues? Absolutely. Are there still issues? You better believe it. But let's be very clear about what the issues are. Let's be very clear what issues have been and what they are. In the past, banks went overboard with fees like charging fees on dormant accounts. That was not good. And I'm happy to say that practice does not exist anymore. Banks would also charge fees without much regard to the nature of their account. So a person making $10,000 a week could end up spending an appreciable sum as a proportion of their income on bank charges, whether by ATM or otherwise. And let's be clear that much of what we see, Madam Speaker, is a symptom of a much deeper issue. Now, the vast majority of fees collected by financial groups, the vast majority in aggregate, are fees paid by companies for debt and equity transactions and stock market traders and demographics that are better able to make informed choices about their financial service providers and better able to afford the fees. The key issue, Madam Speaker, the key issue for public policy and the key issue for this government is the intersection of the fee structures on the vulnerable members of our population. That is the issue. And that is where our concern and public policy ought to be focused, on the intersection with how these fees impact the poor and the vulnerable. Madam Speaker, we do not believe in telling banks what they must charge for a package of services. It doesn't solve the problem. It would only make matters worse. We don't believe in telling the market vendor what she should charge for mangoes or the Sky Juice vendor what he should charge for bag juice. There's a lot of history of failure with policies of price fixing. History has taught us that when you fix prices, the quantity inevitably declines and the quality suffers. The reason is simple. If you fix a price and it is unprofitable to provide the service at the fixed price, the provider will simply choose not to provide the service. And then we have a real problem. Also, whenever you try to fix prices, instead of dealing with the fundamental underlying issues, the entities whose prices have been fixed will simply find a way to pass the cost on to consumers in other more potential and damaging ways. Madam Speaker, we do believe in protecting the poor and the vulnerable. We do believe in protecting the poor and the vulnerable, Madam Speaker. But we don't believe in fixing. Madam Speaker, we believe in making more information available, making policy choices that people can make their own choice. Now, Madam Speaker, there was a time we used to fix who could bring food into Jamaica. You know what happened? The business people just set up in Miami and became suppliers of basic food to Jamaica. Instead of making their money here, they just made their money in Miami. There was a time we used to fix who could import cars. And you know what used to happen? Car prices used to skyrocket every day. The restriction created a shortage. Knee-jerk price fixing doesn't work, no matter how much you shout and scream.
People just don't understand it.
Solving fundamental structural issues works, Madam Speaker. Freedom works, Madam Speaker, and protecting the vulnerable works, Madam Speaker. So we passed an amendment to the Proceeds of Crime Act that allows the Bank of Jamaica to create accounts of low risk and less stringent know your customer requirements for opening bank accounts and with a maximum amount that can be held in this account. Listen to me carefully. We in this House, we, the government, passed laws to create a special category of bank accounts, low-risk bank accounts, low stringent requirement bank accounts that you can open with just your name, your TRN, your address, and a few other details. Madam Speaker, these accounts will be free of bank charges. Madam Speaker, these accounts already exist, and the expectation is that there could be as many as a few 100,000 of these accounts where no fees will be charged. It's up to the consumer to go and open this account. If banking fees on your personal account is the problem, then you get a low KYC account. What else will we do, Madam Speaker? We will reduce the counterproductive asset tax on retail banks and financial institutions, not today, but as soon as we can afford to, on the condition that they pass the savings on to consumers. Madam Speaker, we'll also catalyze greater competition among financial institutions by encouraging public bodies and government entities to maintain diverse deposit and current account relationships. Madam Speaker, we will also actively welcome new investors who meet BOJ's criteria for licensing into the retail banking business. In addition, Madam Speaker, to incentivize and encourage the take-up of these low-risk, less stringent, know-your-customer, no-fee accounts, the government of Jamaica will deposit to each of the first 100,000 KYC accounts $2,500, Madam Speaker, to any customer who opens such an account after April 1st, Madam Speaker. The book says 1,000. Madam Speaker, the policy of this government is to protect the poor and the vulnerable, and we will never resile from it and allow anybody to equate what they want to do with protecting the poor. We will protect the poor and the vulnerable. Anybody, any member, Madam Speaker, of the poor and vulnerable segments of the society, we will encourage you to open a low KYC account at your bank, and if you do it, we will deposit $2,500 in that account for the first 100,000 low KYC accounts. And the low KYC is know your customer, right? They're know your customer procedures that can be quite cumbersome. But we have created a special category of account through legislation and regulation that you can open with less stringent requirements. And for the first 100,000 of them, we're going to deposit $2,500 in those accounts for people. So we're giving you freedom and we're giving you choice. Open the bank account, get your $2,500 and pay no bank fees, Madam Speaker. No, Madam Speaker, what else will we do? What else will we do? Jamaica's own central bank digital currency, JAMDEX, will become a reality in 2022. As I announced in last year's opening budget presentation, as part of the government's digital transformation of the economy, the Bank of Jamaica carried out a pilot of the central bank digital currency in May 2021 that ran to December, and it was quite successful. Central bank digital currency is a form of legal tender, and as legal tender, it's fiat currency, which means it can be exchanged dollar for dollar with physical cash. It's not cryptocurrency. Households and businesses will be able to use JAMDEX to make payments and to store value. Jamaica's CBDC, as I said, is called JAMDEX, and it stands for Jamaica Digital Exchange. JAMDEX allows for the remote transfer of funds anywhere anytime, all midnight, on weekend, public holiday, whenever. And it reduces the hassle of cash transactions. You can transfer to anyone in Jamaica who has an electronic wallet, anywhere at any time. Revolutionary potential, Madam Speaker. It allows businesses to be more cash efficient, and it doesn't come with huge cash handling fees. JAMDEX allows for greater financial institutions, and it has the potential to bring the unbanked into the financial system. All Jamaicans will have access to JAMDEX through a JAMDEX-enabled wallet. And users can obtain a JAMDEX wallet automatically if they already have an account. If you don't have a bank account, all you need is name, address, date of birth, TRN, and a government issued ID. Boom, and you have your JAMDEX account. And to carry out a JAMDEX transaction anywhere at any time, you just access and download an app on your mobile phone using the networks of any of the two major telecom providers. You can top up your account with JAMDEX through all authorized agents. Not all of them will be banks, some of them will be non-banks, authorized agents or smart ABMs using physical cash or online, and do business using JAMDEX phone to phone with merchants, friends and family. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed a lot of things. People have had to improve, to innovate, and to improvise. I have a barber, you see, whose name is Paul. And he used to operate at a shop before COVID. But since COVID, Paul turned mobile. He came to my house yesterday to give me a haircut prior to the presentation. When he was finished, I realized I didn't have all the cash to pay, I only had some. So he said to me, man, no problem, man, no worry. You can pay me using JAMDEX. I said, what? With a quizzical look on my face. He said, JAMDEX, man, the new central bank digital currency. He said, me not the pilot. So let me tell you something. Paul is here today. Paul the barber is here today. And I am going to log into my Links JAMDEX account. And I am going to pay Paul the $500 I owe him using central bank digital currency JAMDEX. Watch me now. Watch me. I hit transfer. I look for Paul. Here's Paul. How much I say? 500? All right. No. I'm going to click send. Ready? Click send. Send in the $500 right here. It gets sent. And watch here now. See it right there. You see there? Nigel Clarke. $500 of central bank digital currency live and direct on your television screen. The first JAMDEX transaction in public transaction in Jamaica. No. You know the first thing. You know the best thing about JAMDEX? The best thing about JAMDEX, you know is what? No bank fees. No bank fees. You know another thing about JAMDEX? No cash, no problem. No cash, no problem. You know another good thing about JAMDEX? It's just phone to phone. Anywhere, anytime. Madam Speaker, on the liberalization of the telecoms market, and the new entry of a market participation. I remember a politician said, he stand up and say, you can call yourself. Well, I am here to tell you, almost 2 decades later, in 2022, that under this government, Madam Speaker, with Jamdex, Madam Speaker, you can pay yourself. So, Madam Speaker, the national rollout of CBDC is scheduled to begin in the beginning of the next quarter. A key milestone is to bring legislation to Parliament to make the Bank of Jamaica the sole issuer of Jamdex, and for it to be legally recognized as legal tender. The BOJ expects to add 4 more additional wallet providers by June. A network is more successful the larger it is. The more corner shops, the more vendors that accept Jamdex, the more useful it becomes. When we have the Cane Man, when we have Nutsy, when we have Soupy, and when Keisha can collect the partner draw through Jamdex, Madam Speaker, with our igloo, is then we're going to be rolling, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, the discourse needs to take place in the broader context of the seismic shift in our societies and the world, and the rapid move towards a digital society. This shift was well established prior to the pandemic, but was greatly accelerated due to the necessities created by the pandemic, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister and I would have had several conversations about accelerating, the need to accelerate this change. And Jamaica will have no choice but to keep up with the world or get ahead of the digital revolution. To resist this change is to be left behind, and we cannot afford that. Madam Speaker, the last population and housing census was in 2011. We should have had one in 2021. We've had it every 10 years. The pandemic interrupted it. I'm pleased, Madam Speaker, to announce that the 15th population census will be held in 2022. Population census is when you get relevant statistics and data on the Jamaican population, is used by government to make policy and by businesses to locate their business establishments. The census day will be September 12, 2022, Madam Speaker, and a count will be made and data collected in respect of persons who are usual residents of Jamaica, whether physically present or not on that date. This will provide an estimate of the Jamaican population at that time. Recruitment and training of 8,000 temporary field workers, including area managers, census supervisors, census takers, and data editors, is underway. Interviewers will be deployed island-wide to visit each household, private and non-private, to complete a questionnaire for each household and each member of that household. The main data collection phase is expected to last up to December 2022, with a general census report available by December 2023. But let me just say something that I meant to say that I didn't say. We are also going to incentivize the Jamdex accounts. That the first 100,000 digital currency wallets will, after April 1st, will receive a deposit from the government of Jamaica of $2,500. So you set up your digital wallet, all right? You set up your digital wallet, and if you're among the first 100,000 after the 1st of April, the government, obviously it ends at the end of the fiscal year, the government will deposit $2,500 on your behalf. So what we're doing, we are encouraging you, we're giving you a choice. If you go in that direction and you open a digital wallet, not only do you pay no bank fees, but the government will deposit $2,500 for you. Madam Speaker, the Marcus Garvey Public Digital Currency, yes. The Marcus Garvey Public Sector Graduate Scholarship was established in 2020 by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service as a human capital development tool. I'm very pleased, Madam Speaker, that the Scholarship Selection Committee, chaired by His Excellency, selected the first 30 Marcus Garvey scholars who will be attending UWI, attending UTech. These are from public sector employees. We're building the capacity of the public sector. UWI, UTech, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and Cambridge universities, Madam Speaker. And they will study a range of disciplines: economics, education, public health, national security, urban planning, climate change, and procurement, all aligned with the government's policy focus. Madam Speaker, we're proud of the fact that the Marcus Garvey Scholarship is the most ambitious scholarship program in Jamaica's history. In July 2021, Madam Speaker, the Student Loan Bureau celebrated 50 years. It owes its origin to the government of Prime Minister Hugh Shearer, in which the Most Honourable Edward Seaga served as Minister of Finance. The Student Loans Bureau approved 11,000 student loans this year, an increase of 1,000 or 10% over the previous year, which is good news. And last year, Madam Speaker, 43% of the applications were submitted online with the document upload functionalities. With new loan management system being procured, eventually all applications and guarantors will be eventually submitted online using an online portal, and it will improve processing times and customer experience. The SLB is embracing the government's digital strategy. And with the online system, customers will be able to pay online and inquire about balances online. This year, the government also expects that up to 3,000 students who qualify based on needs will benefit from over $150 million of grants, money not to be repaid, from the Student Loan Bureau. So you come to the Student Loan Bureau and you're in need, you get a grant first, even before we talk about any loan. Madam Speaker. Now, Madam Speaker, I want to turn my attention to the restructuring of the public sector compensation, the implementation of which is to begin this upcoming fiscal year. This reform does not stand on its own, but is accompanied by public body rationalization, the introduction of the human resource system, My HR Plus, across the public sector, digitization of public sector services, and implementation of shared services. These are all critically important reforms which are ongoing. Today, however, I want to address the restructuring of public sector compensation, which is an ambitious, complex, and necessary reform. Let me start by recognizing our partners in the unions and bargaining groups on multiple fronts. First, they gave the government space to put the proposals in place by agreeing to a 4-year wage agreement in 2018. I can safely say that your trust and confidence in the government has resulted in a significant gain in addressing the long-standing issues of equity, uneven application of increases, and inadequate salaries. Unfortunately, we had to delay the implementation of the compensation restructuring due to the increased expenditure and collapse of revenues from the pandemic. Before my budget speech last year, I met with all unions and bargaining groups and laid out the case for a modest salary increase for the public sector in 21-22, and I repeated this proposal in my opening budget presentation. To do otherwise would have risked the stability on which our economic recovery depends. Over the past 12 months, I've had the opportunity for detailed dialogue with our partners in unions and bargaining groups. As conditions improve in the first quarter, we are able to favorably adjust our modest offer. And although it hasn't been all smooth sailing, we can be collectively proud of the fact that for practical purposes, the government has completed negotiations with bargaining groups and unions representing almost the entire public sector workforce. To the best of my knowledge, Madam Speaker, we have not had such an efficient resolution in a bargaining round, completing all negotiations within 12 months in a long time. One of the strengths of Jamaica, despite our many problems, is the level of social cohesion in our society. Some of it evidenced by things we can see. A lot of it, however, lies behind the scenes. I want to take a moment to salute those in our society who value people over politics and who value cohesion as a noble goal and as an end in itself. We depend on public services every day, taking the bus, using roads, accessing hospitals, paying schools, etc. Paying for licenses and permits, accessing PATH, NIS. And I have the privilege to talk to representatives of all segments of persons who provide public services, who are paid from the public purse. And when I say all, I mean all. One thing they have in common is that they all believe that they're not adequately or fairly compensated. And this is a problem. It's a problem, including people in this House. But it's also true that if you poll members of the Jamaican public, a vast majority will tell you that they're dissatisfied with the level of public service they receive. This also is a problem. We have to address both problems, and that is what we propose to do. The current structure of public sector compensation, Madam Speaker, has 185 allowances and 325 scales. And this is utterly unworkable, inequitable, complex, and it leads to unfairness. In the United Kingdom, they have 67 million people. We have 2.7 million. The UK has 7 pay grades. We have 325. Now, if I wanted to illustrate it for you, Madam Speaker, I have here all of the salary grades in the Jamaican public sector, printed one per line with the salary scales. Now, I want to show you how long 325 is. If you can pass this to Minister Shaw. Take your time. Or further down, right? Madam Speaker, this is 325 salary scales. This is what it looks like, Madam Speaker. And this is what we have to reform. And I want to show you, Madam Speaker, that I have written down the pay scales in the United Kingdom on the back of a Jamaican postcard. 7 salary grades in the United Kingdom, 325 in Jamaica. Can this make any sense? It cannot make any sense at all for such a small country. We have to have the ambition, we have to have the courage to reform this complex system. Madam Speaker, I can posit that there's no one person in the public sector that can recite even a third of those salary grades. This structure has evolved primarily through the use of multiple job evaluation tools to create different classifications and job families over the years. So you have people doing essentially the same jobs who are paid entirely differently. I want to give you an example here, Madam Speaker. Every time I come to this parliament, or frequently, I get a little note from upstairs that reminds me of the unfairness of the system. I want to tell you that we're going to solve the problem. The stenographers who serve this parliament, Madam Speaker, and record the spoken word, they work in parliament, and you have stenographers in the courts. Same set of skills, very similar jobs, but there may be differences, but very similar jobs, stenographers. But in our complicated system, I just show you, one of them have 1 grade up here, sir. The other one have a grade down there, sir. And they're compensated entirely differently. This breeds inequity, it breeds tension, it breeds resentment and negative attitudes. It's one thing, Madam Speaker, to be a poor country, which we are for now, on the path to prosperity. But that does not mean that our systems should be unfair. We can be poor, but just. We can lack resources, but be fair. Jamaicans will accept the limits of our economic realities imposed if they are assured that the allocation of scarce resources is fair and sufficiently robust accountability systems are in place. So it is imperative that we reform our compensation system to make it at the very least internally consistent and fair. We will pursue reform, Madam Speaker, to restore, you might tell you, recovery, reform and restoration. We will restore equity and fairness in public sector compensation. Another feature of our compensation system is that it evolved to be complicated, 185 allowances, which is also unmanageable. We never got there by design. Over decades, in the context of chronic economic instability, we tinkered with systems and put in place permanent measures to offset wage freezes and wage guidelines and appease bargaining units. So several bargaining groups have allowance categories that only they get. And those unique allowances tend to be significant in aggregate size. So in the past, what would happen is you'd hold strain on the headline number, and then you get your special allowance area over here, moved by varying amounts. Or you'd introduce an entirely new allowance. Seems like a practical solution, doesn't it? However, it has huge negative structural impact when compounded over decades and across 40 bargaining groups. You end up with a convoluted public compensation system we have today, where the wage bargaining process is costly for everyone and highly inefficient. This allowance framework breeds inequity and resentment, and a lot of it based on real inequities, but some of it based on imagination, because it is so opaque and so non-transparent. We have several bargaining groups within the same general family of jobs. Take the health sector. Same general family of jobs that are splintered solely and completely as a result of having different categories of allowances, which then leads to separate negotiations and a more complex process, longer to sort out, less efficient. Madam Speaker, a policy position we've adopted is that greater fiscal transparency serves the public good. And I've been consistent about fiscal transparency. Citizens' budget that we launched in 2018 went further this year than made it social media. Public investment map, where you can follow capital investment programs on the Ministry of Finance's website. Establishing a fiscal commission. This just now announced we're going to try and support the Auditor General's Department with additional $89 million to deal with back audits. But one major aberration is that the single biggest expenditure item in the budget is one line item, and it says $290 billion. And it is not transparent, Madam Speaker, because of the myriad of 185 allowances. And this allowance system is unwieldy and opaque. And what happens is that different groups end up with different net increases in pay depending on the allowance structure, and no one else knows or understands. So this group over here have a different allowance salary structure. You touch the allowance and then their net increases here, and this group over here, you touch the allowance and their net increases here, right? And it breeds, it is not best in class. If you want to develop as a country, we have to do and march in a direction of development. Now, Madam Speaker, this is public sector workers' salary, but they're paid with taxpayer funds. And the public has a right to understand how much is paid and what the total impact of increases represent. Now, the worst part of it is that the lack of transparency affects the public sector employee as well, who in some instances don't know the true value of their total compensation because it's stacked with a myriad of allowances. You've looked, some of these pay slips are filled with lines because there's so many allowances that people get sometimes. You need a spreadsheet to calculate what you earn, and then some of them are tax-free. So you don't even know what the true value of your compensation is because you have to gross it up for taxes. So by way of example, and I'm not talking about any particular group or any particular job, I'm just picking some numbers to make an example. You might hear someone say, my salary is $950,000 gross. But when you check it out, their total compensation is 1.8 million. When you factor in that the allowance, some allowance is tax-free, is actually valued at 1.9 million or 2 million. But the public conversation is around a value of 950,000 and not around 2 million. So this system of non-transparency leads us to be non-transparent with ourselves, which is the worst of it. So, and even the government has difficulty keeping track of the aggregate increase if you go changing 185 of them across 40 bargaining groups. Just imagine the complexity. We cannot want systems that foster transparency in other fiscal matters and not want transparency in the single biggest line item of expenditure. This has to change, Madam Speaker, and it will change. Now, Madam Speaker, it's got to the stage where some bargaining groups have an allowance to salary ratio of 30% allowances, 70% salary. Some of them have 50% allowance, 50% salary, 60% allowance, 40% salary. Now, this has real negative consequences down the road. If your total compensation is $100 and 50% is allowances, and you put in all the decades of service to qualify for the maximum pension of 2/3 of salary, you only retire on 33% of your compensation, or $33, and that is at the maximum. So you used to earn $100 before, $50 in salary, $50 in compensation, in allowances. Allowances are non-pensionable. So when you retire, you just retire under 50. At the maximum, you're going to get 33. So one day you make 100. I know you don't need as much in retirement, right? But to go from 100 to 33 is a big jump. Some of them who are not at the maximum will go to 25 or even 20. So, Madam Speaker, it doesn't work for the public sector employee at all. And this unmanageable allowance complexity, Madam Speaker, needs to change. At the end of a long period of service, people feel a sense of disappointment, resentment, right? And it feeds the notion that Jamaica is an unfair place. As I said, we can be poor, but we must be just. And we are going to restore equity, Madam Speaker, internal equity and justice in how we pay our public sector. Now, one of the big problems is that we can't attract and retain the talent we need in the public service. Those who serve the public sector do so mainly out of service to country. And you'll hear from time to time they say they're subsidizing government operations. Now, this House, Madam Speaker, ought to remind that Jamaica has a serious problem of our skilled and educated graduates migrating overseas to seek better economic opportunities. In fact, the Human Flight and Brain Index, where 0 is low and 10 is high, in 2021 ranked Jamaica as a 9. The Human Flight and Brain Indicator considers the economic impact of human displacement for economic or political reasons. The higher the index, the greater the displacement. I go further. We examine resignation data for two public sector entities, a ministry and a department of government. In the case of the ministry, between 2014 and 2021, we had 44 exit interviews, 44. And 30 of the individuals who resigned did so because they were dissatisfied with their compensation. In the case of the government department we surveyed, between 2016 and 2020, there were 214 resignations. And from the exit interviews, of that number, of the 214, 209 individuals indicated that poor compensation was a reason for their resignation. In addition, Madam Speaker, there are technical, analytical, managerial, and other posts that cannot be filled and take months to be filled because of how competitive compensation is. Madam Speaker, the picture is clear. As a government, we can't sit idly by and continue to kick the can down the road and not address this challenge. We cannot sit idly by and allow what is clearly unsustainable to continue. Madam Speaker, the 2-year wage cycle, which had its origins in Jamaica's history of chronic economic instability, high inflation, and lack of fiscal prudence, worked against substantial reform. Historically, by the time the government concluded its engagement with 40 unions and bargaining groups, the 2-year period would have long expired, and we would have been halfway through or at the end of a new 2-year cycle. I want to pause again and to thank our partners in the unions and in bargaining groups who trusted the government and invested in us with a 4-year wage deal back in 2018. We used that 4-year period to design an entirely new public sector compensation system built on 4 principles. The first principle is that it must be simple and easy to understand. The public sector employee must understand it, and Jamaicans must understand it. And it must be clear and clean and coherent, and people should see the value in their total compensation, which means we reduce the number of allowances, which is cumbersome and complex and difficult to manage. The second is that the new compensation system should be fair and equitable, which means we have a consistent way of determining pay across the public service. We have one job evaluation system. We reduce the 325 scales to something that's more manageable. And we group jobs that have the same function, and we ascribe to them the same value. Thirdly, not something we can do immediately, but that we hope to do by the time implementation is finished in 3 years, is that we must recognize and reward performance. This business that performance is such that everybody, we have to have a clear link between performance and pay progression, moving away from incremental progression based on length of service to one that's based on performance. That aspect will take a little while to implement. Finally, Madam Speaker, the system must be sustainable and affordable. While it's important to maintain competitive compensation levels in order to build a strong public sector, we can't defeat ourselves and throw away fiscal sustainability we have achieved from 10 years of sacrifice. A restructured compensation system must therefore be fiscally consistent with the debt reduction objectives enshrined in our fiscal rules, which underpin the stability we enjoy, while without compromising the levels of capital spending required to catalyze growth and improve the quality of life. Madam Speaker, public sector compensation improvement will cost over $100 billion over 3 years. Because our recovery is on track, we will reform public sector compensation and restore a better, fairer, simpler, and more transparent compensation system. It will be characterized by simplicity, better efficiency, improved pension, and greater transparency for the individual and for the country, and ultimately will be a contributing factor to better quality service. Now, approximately $17 billion of the figure above relates to certain categories of allowances that up until the current fiscal year have been classified in programs and not in wages. That's another aspect of our non-transparency. $17 billion of what is compensation expenditure, which was not in a line item, wages and salaries. We stand for fiscal transparency through and through. Madam Speaker, the effective date of implementation will be April 1st, 2022. Now, that does not mean, Madam Speaker, that doesn't mean, Madam Speaker, that your April paycheck is going to reflect the restructured compensation. First, we want to have the opportunity to continue our engagement with public sector unions and bargaining groups, and to provide more information and to fine-tune the system. We then propose, Madam Speaker, that early in the second quarter of the new fiscal year, the implementation will begin, but it will be effective, retroactive to April 1st, 2022. Every public sector employee will know from before what your salary will be this year, what it will be next year, and what it will be the third year, when we have completed the implementation of the new compensation system. You will have clarity and you will have transparency. Now, Madam Speaker, some people have expressed some worry that if they receive a tax-free allowance today and tomorrow that allowance does not exist anymore, that they may be adversely impacted. Allow me to say clearly and emphatically, Madam Speaker, that no public sector employees' net pay will be lower as a result of the new compensation system. In fact, every public sector employee's net pay will be higher as a result of the new public sector compensation system. Some people use language like rolling in, etc. But the better way to think about it is that we're not patching up an old system to create a new one. We're abandoning the existing cumbersome, complex, unworkable, unsustainable compensation system and implementing a new compensation system that incorporates the principles I mentioned earlier. Let me also be clear on another matter. Once we begin implementing the restructuring of public sector compensation, Jamaicans will expect more from the public sector, and rightly so. Because it is taxpayer money that is paying these salaries, Jamaicans will expect more from their civil servants, more from their parliamentarians, more from their ministers. Madam Speaker, you can hit for that. You can. Now, Madam Speaker, let me be clear that this compensation structure is not coming cheap. The implementation of restructured public sector compensation will lead to a significant rise in the wage bill, which will likely breach the wage to GDP target of 9% in Jamaica's fiscal responsibility laws. So we'll need the appropriate legislative amendment. In this year, with the start of compensation restructuring, the wage to GDP ratios are projected to be 11.4%, and this has already prompted concern. This reform is happening in a context where, as I said before, Jamaica is not yet out of the woods. Our debt is still very high, and our economy remains vulnerable to potential shocks. Higher interest and wage costs limit flexibility to respond to crisis. As a result, these concerns cannot be dismissed. Madam Speaker, I want you to consider the following facts: that Jamaica has one of the highest levels of wage to GDP ratios in our hemisphere, even prior to this reform. The graph shows 30 Latin American and Caribbean countries, and Jamaica has the 8th highest wage bill as a proportion to GDP, and this is in 2021, even before our compensation review. When you add interest, Madam Speaker, and this is where Jamaica has the 4th highest level of wages and interest as a proportion of GDP in our hemisphere. The 4th highest wages and interest as a proportion of GDP, which introduces tremendous inflexibility in our fiscal arrangements. Wages and interest in 2021 accounted for over 16% of GDP. The result, Madam Speaker, is that Jamaica ranks 22nd out of 26 Latin American and Caribbean countries for whom data is available in capital, social, and other expenditure. It goes hand in hand. The more of your budget that you spend on interest and on wages, the less you can spend on capital, social, and other expenditures. Now, this is just our reality, but what's important is that we understand our reality, Madam Speaker. And I want to spend just for this to be properly and carefully understood. It's very important, Madam Speaker. So I want to show you what the structure of Jamaica's expenditure looks like vis-a-vis, let's choose 2 countries. I could choose any other 2. I'd just choose Trinidad and Peru. And I'm looking at the structure, Madam Speaker, if I may temporarily speak from a seat other than my own, from the structure, right, in terms of the proportion of our budget that's allocated to different areas. So, Madam Speaker, Jamaica, if this represents, represents wages, Madam Speaker, Jamaica spends this amount on wages, right? And then we spend this amount on interest. When you look at Trinidad, Madam Speaker, Trinidad would spend this amount. I don't know if it can be seen. Trinidad would spend that amount on wages, and they will spend this amount on interest. See the difference between Jamaica and Trinidad? They have a lot more space to spend on capital, social, and other expenditures versus us, okay? This is percentage of your overall budget, so everything should be the same height. So as a result, what ends up happening is that Jamaica ends up spending, no, I'm just telling you a snapshot. Jamaica, it was worse than this before. Jamaica, Madam Speaker, ends up spending this on other expenditure, right? And then what's left is we can only do this amount of capital expenditure. Now, I want to tell you, other expenditure, Madam Speaker, includes road maintenance, Minister Warmington, garbage collection, police car, drugs for hospitals, computer for school, textbook, just operating expenditure. The green represents capital expenditure, garbage truck, fire truck, JUTC bus, highway, hospital, school, police station, the green. When it comes to the, just comparing with another country, because they have so much space, on other expenditure, they can spend a lot more. They can come in and spend this amount on other expenditure, right? On operating expenditure, Madam Speaker, and in fact, a little more than that. And then, Madam Speaker, it allows them space to spend more on capital expenditure as a percentage of their budget. So this is what our structure looks like, and this is what another country, let's just not call it, another country's structure looks like, right? Where, and here we're talking about percentage of your budget. Proportion. So they could be, their economy could be a lot bigger than ours, but the proportion, we are spending this amount on interest and on wages, and therefore it leaves that amount for everything else. So the ambition, Madam Speaker, of the government is to get to a position where our economy...
Nigel.
Yes, sir.
Take off one of the blue bricks, because since it's proportional, it will give you
a proper thing. All right. Yeah, so it's like that. Right, thank you. So where we want to get to, Madam Speaker, is that our economy is larger in size, but a smaller percentage is spent on wages and interest, right? So, in the future, if we can be in a position, that's what we are like today, where the economy is larger, let's see if I can make it larger, and so we spend that on interest, on wages, right? Percentage of the economy is a larger economy, we spend that on interest, and then it puts us in a position where we can do this on operating expenditure, and we can do this on capital expenditure, right? A bigger economy, but different proportions, Madam Speaker. That is where we need to go. And that is where wage to GDP ratios actually matter, right? That is where wage to GDP matters, Madam Speaker. So it's not a theoretical concern. These are not theoretical concerns. Because when you have this, Madam Speaker, your flexibility is a lot less. You can't cut the yellow or the red. The only thing you have to, that is discretionary, not even the blue is discretionary. You have to, the blue is motor car for police, etc., etc. You have a little play with. Whereas this country, when they're in crisis, they have a lot more flexibility. So the goal of government, and it used to be a lot worse. We're coming from a position where the red and the yellow would be up to here. That's where we're coming from. So, Madam Speaker, we're making progress. It's going to take time, but we're going to get to a position where we'll be able to spend more of our budget on capital and on operating expenditure for the people of Jamaica. So, Madam Speaker, this fiscal year, the central government plans to spend a total of $912 billion, comprised of $604.5 billion on non-debt expenditure, $307.5 billion on debt service, or $912 billion. The program's central government non-debt expenditure above the line is $604.5 billion and reflects an increase of 5%, or $29.2 billion, 5.2%, over the non-debt third supplementary estimates. The central bank government's non-debt expenditure is $539.4 billion in recurrent expenditure and $65.1 billion in capital expenditure. Madam Speaker, as I mentioned, compensation for employees accounts for the large share of recurrent expenditure. 53% of recurrent expenditure, or $290.2 billion. It includes $6.4 billion towards the payment of government contribution to the public health scheme and $1.4 billion to settle employers' contribution to the NHT. Along with fixed motor vehicle allowances previously classified under programs, these are now in compensation of employees. Madam Speaker, just highlights on recurrent allocation, $40 billion towards public sector pension payments. Madam Speaker, $40 billion. $3 billion to the payment of streetlights, Madam Speaker, and $1.2 billion to the Student Loans Bureau. There will be $3.6 billion to Statin, of which $2.4 billion is to cover the cost of Jamaica's 15th housing census. Education will continue to receive the lion's share of the budget, with $122 billion representing 20.2% of the non-debt expenditure. Health, Madam Speaker, next at $93.1 billion, and national security at $92.4 billion, as the government continues to prioritize health and national security as important to the people, to the well-being of the people of Jamaica. In agriculture, allocation $800 million for farm roads and $1 billion for production incentives. And, Madam Speaker, on social spending, $16.9 billion being allocated to the PATH program, of which certain components for the cash grant, $7.9 billion, $800 million for social pension, and $7.7 billion towards the Ministry of Education for student nutritional support, $6.3 billion, $1 billion for the provision of textbooks, and $380 million for past school transportation. Given the catalytic impact of capital expenditure, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased that we're increasing capital expenditure by 20% in 2022-2023. What is more significant is that last year's capital budget benefited from a one-off dividend from the central bank, which we did not have this year, but I'm pleased that we still grow CapEx by 20%. We're well on our way to restoring capital expenditure to pre-pandemic levels. We'll continue to prioritize infrastructure expenditure, which increases the productivity of the economy, provides employment, and is therefore growth enhancing. As such, within the capital budget, $20.7 billion is allocated to the Southern Coastal Highway, $4.9 billion to the Montego Bay Perimeter Road, $4.9 billion to the Ministry of Health for the program to expand hospitals throughout Jamaica, $2.4 billion to the National Identification Project, and $1.9 billion for the procurement of 50 of 100 garbage trucks for acquisition of the following 50 in the next fiscal year. Now, I'm particularly pleased, Madam Speaker, about the planned $4.5 billion of capital investments in the agricultural sector, the largest capex in agriculture in at least a decade. Of this amount, $1.4 billion is for the Southern Plains Agricultural Project, Madam Speaker, to bring irrigation on former sugarcane lands in South Clarendon and South St. Catherine, and $2.7 billion for the Essex Valley Irrigation Infrastructure Development Program, Madam Speaker. In addition, there's a contingency provision in the Public Investment Management System of $5.3 billion under the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service to support the public investment pipeline projects which are expected to gain cabinet approval before the end of the current fiscal year. These projects include, and 5.3 billion is for all of them, for all that we're spending this year, rather, procurement of 50 JUTC buses, Madam Speaker. Construction of the St. Catherine North Divisional Headquarters. The upgrading and renovation of justice centres in Clarendon and Hanover, among others. And, Madam Speaker, a small amount, or some amount, just over $1 billion, I think 1.5 or 1.6 billion of the 5.3, to start construction of the Houses of Parliament building. Madam Speaker, the way the Ministry of Finance sees it is that this is economic efficiency demands better functionality of our Parliament. We can only meet. There's only one room we can meet in, which means our business progresses according to a certain space. Little Barbados, for the last 300 years that they've had their Parliament, has a separate room for the Senate and a separate room for the Parliament. So a committee can meet the same time as the Parliament, and they have 3 rooms, a separate room for committee meetings, Little Barbados, and we wonder about their efficiency. We have one chamber in which all meetings take place. We need to have a Parliament where we can conduct multiple parliamentary meetings and matters at the same time, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in addition to this, public bodies are scheduled to implement 73 projects at a cost of $29 billion, which means total capital expenditure will be $94.2 billion. Madam Speaker, our CapEx budget is geared towards facilitating growth and improving quality of life. We have several programs to stimulate economic activity by boosting access to finance, which is the oxygen of business. I'm pleased, Madam Speaker, to inform the Parliament and the public that the Development Bank of Jamaica will allocate $7 billion for loans to MSMEs in 2022-23. $7 billion. Yes. And in addition, the Credit Enhancement Program will guarantee credit in support of an additional $6 billion in loans to MSMEs, Madam Speaker. That is $13 billion in loans for MSMEs, Madam Speaker. We have never even come remotely close to a figure that large. By far, this is the first time in double digits, and this represents a significant increase over the prior year. Madam Speaker, we'll be building an economy that promotes finances and invests in innovation. We have a project with the IDB called the Big E Project, boosting innovation, growth, entrepreneurship ecosystems, etc. We're going to have an innovation grant fund that provides grants for innovation. There are 2 incubator programs that are expected, and something we negotiated with the IDB, placed it with the DVJ because it's the best place for it. But we have 2 incubator programs to provide training and mentorship and incubation support to 140 potential Jamaican startups. 3 accelerator programs, which are expected to provide acceleration services to 90 scalable Jamaican startup companies. And a seed fund that provides grants and technical assistance to scalable startups. In addition, Madam Speaker, under the Biggie program, we're going to have a patent grant fund. You ever hear about a patent fund in Jamaica yet? Because this government, we have high ambition, and we believe that patents in Jamaica can be commercialized. So we're having a patent grant fund that those who have patents can come to the grant fund, get a grant to see if they can commercialize their patent. And there'll be a seed fund that provides grants and technical assistance to scalable, a sidecar fund rather, that invests alongside established angel investor networks. Madam Speaker, there's never been a better time to start on an entrepreneurial journey in Jamaica. And the Jamaican people seem to agree in that the number of companies being formed in Jamaica just continues to rise year over year. In addition, Madam Speaker, several equity and venture capital funds will come into existence this year, specifically focused on SMEs and early-stage businesses. There's never been a better time to be an SME or an early-stage company in Jamaica. Having friends with money or family with money will no longer be a prerequisite to pursue an entrepreneurial career. Young people, hear me. We want to commoditize equity financing in Jamaica. All you need is great marketable commercial ideas, managerial and technical competence, energy and passion and integrity. Under the Big E program, Madam Speaker, the DBJ will be sponsoring a venture capital fund capitalized at $2 billion Jamaican dollars, targeting early-stage businesses. The government will invest $750 million, and the balance will come from private investors. We're working with the World Bank, and the DBJ will sponsor an SME private equity fund, also capitalized at $2 billion. Again, the government will invest $750 million alongside private capital. Under the Serve Jamaica program, Madam Speaker, DBJ will sponsor 2 growth SME funds with a combined capitalization of $6 billion, in which the government will invest a total of $2 billion alongside private capital. And there's been a selection process, Madam Speaker, in this fiscal year where those fund managers have already been selected. Madam Speaker, 2 plus 2 plus 6 equals $10 billion in private equity financing, Madam Speaker, not debt, private equity financing for early stage and SME companies. And this is a game changer in Jamaica, Madam Speaker, absolute game changer. Never has so much private equity financing been available for small and medium-sized businesses and early stage companies in Jamaica. Having these funds operate at the same time is an intentional strategy. We hope to generate competition among funds for the best investment opportunities, which creates a healthy venture capital and private equity system, especially for entrepreneurs and those with SMEs and early-stage companies. In addition to the government sponsorship of funds, several private equity funds and venture capital companies have emerged of their own accord over the past few years, following the legislative amendments we made to the pension investment regulations. Madam Speaker, the government is seeking to attract potential investors for the establishment of integrated resort developments in Jamaica. An integrated resort development must have a minimum of 1,000 hotel rooms, of which a minimum of 500 of those hotel rooms are luxury rooms. Furthermore, it must have a minimum capital investment of $500 million US. Madam Speaker, we intend to grant 2 integrated resort licenses in the upcoming fiscal year, which will eventually mean a combined investment of at least $1 billion US, but probably more. To that end, the government issued a request for applications for approved integrated resort developments on October 6, 2021. We received 9 sets of queries from 4 potential investors seeking clarification for the process. The deadline for submission to the requests for proposals or requests for applications is tomorrow, March 9, 2022. Madam Speaker, we have an enterprise team in place which will make a recommendation for approval that will eventually lead to at least $1 billion US being invested in an integrated resource in Jamaica. Madam Speaker, since the global financial crisis of 2008, when our finances were impaired, several successive administrations have used a state-to-state model of highway infrastructure procurement, where we have borrowed from the China Exim Bank with the understanding that the construction would be undertaken by China Harbour Engineering, one of the largest construction firms in China. This model has served Jamaica well. We have some really great highways that have improved quality of life and enhanced productivity. Jamaica would not have been able to finance the build-out of infrastructure over the period from 2008 until now without such a model. And without the cooperation, Madam Speaker, or without this cooperation with the Chinese government. And as Minister of Finance, I express deep gratitude to China Exim Bank, which provided these loans. China, yes. China, through China Exim Bank, is Jamaica's largest bilateral creditor, but our debt to China Exim Bank only represents 5% of Jamaica's overall debt. But due to the sacrifice of Jamaicans, Jamaica is in a healthier fiscal position now as compared to 2008 or 2011 or 2016. And we intend to further improve Jamaica's financial resilience. We can attract huge volumes of private capital to Jamaica in a way that we could not before. And as such, we can pursue a graduated model of highway infrastructure procurement, one that is open and competitive. We're working with the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, on this. And, Madam Speaker, we expect to come to market with over $150 billion of additional infrastructure projects over the next 3 years. And I'm being very conservative. In fact, we expect over $200 billion, Madam Speaker, of infrastructure projects over the next 3 years. Madam Speaker, we expect CAP to restart this fiscal year. Madam Speaker, by June we should be up to 50% capacity, and by September we should be up to 100%, barring any unforeseen circumstances, Madam Speaker, even though it won't be the most efficient production as we're using a temporary solution. Madam Speaker, while we continue, so those suite of measures, Madam Speaker, we expect to be additional, additive to growth, or to support growth. The SME financing, loan financing of $13 billion, equity financing of $10 billion, as well as the mega projects, integrated resorts, the highway procurement, etc. Madam Speaker, while we continue to depend on physical cash, there's a need to make cash transactions more efficient. And technical studies have shown the need for the introduction of a currency denomination between the $1,000 note and the $5,000 note. The Bank of Jamaica advised me that about a year ago or earlier, that the introduction of a $2,000 note is necessary and would bring greater efficiency to the currency structure, allowing cash transactions to be settled easier. With the introduction of a $2,000 note alongside a $1,000 note and a $5,000 note, persons will require fewer notes to settle transactions. In addition, the introduction of a new currency denomination allows us to leverage technology and material science improvements and upgrade the family of notes to achieve greater cost efficiencies. Today, our currency denominations use a mixture of material called substrates. The $50 and $100 notes use a hybrid substrate, which is a mixture of cotton and polymer. The $500, $1,000, and the $5,000 are on varnished cotton. These are not the most durable substrates, Madam Speaker, that are available today. The introduction of a substrate that offers a significant increase in durability will yield substantial benefits as it relates to the average circulation life of banknotes, which in turn will lead to lower order quantities with less frequency relative to current practice. There are substrates such as pure polymer, which is used in many countries like the United Kingdom, which have a much longer life and are therefore much more cost-effective. Banknote design is one of the methods used worldwide to deter counterfeiting, and as such, over the past decade, banknote printers have developed more sophisticated security features to minimize counterfeiting. It is important that the state-of-the-art technology used in the banknote printing industry be incorporated in Jamaica's banknotes. Although each of our current banknotes has one feature that caters to the visually impaired, either large numbering or tactile printing, the effectiveness of such features has been questioned by this community. An upgrade of the banknotes will therefore also provide the opportunity to implement enhancements which ensure that the visually impaired are easily able to identify the notes. There are concerns among the Jamaican public that the colors of the $500 note and the $5,000 note are not easily distinguishable, especially in low light conditions, and this has resulted in individuals tendering $5,000 instead of $500, especially at night. We need distinct color separations between notes, where you can take them out even as you emerge from a taxi at 11 p.m. And this is consistent with research and best practice. An upgrade of our banknotes will make this possible. So the Bank of Jamaica has been engaged in an upgrade refreshing of the banknotes to introduce a new $2,000 denomination, provide cost savings through increased durability of the banknotes, enhance security of the banknotes to reduce the risk of counterfeiting, enhance the banknote features to meet the needs of the visually impaired, and to ensure that the color and other distinctions among banknotes of different denominations is clear. By policy, Madam Speaker, Jamaica's banknotes feature national heroes and deceased prime ministers or premiers. However, currently, the existing banknotes, Madam Speaker, the $50 note, the $100 note, the $500 note, the $100 note, and the $5,000 note only feature 2 out of 7 national heroes and 3 out of a possible 4 deceased prime ministers. Of the 5 national heroes not on notes, 4 are on coins. Alexander Bustamante is on the $1 coin, Norman Manley is on the $5 coin, George William Gordon is on the $10 coin, and Marcus Garvey is on the $20 coin. Paul Bogle, who led the Mark Bay Rebellion and was hung on the gallows for this, but whose sacrifice paved the way for representative government in Jamaica, is not represented on Jamaica's currency today. He was featured on the $2 note until it was dematerialized in 1994, and he was later placed on the 10-cent coin. But all denominations below $1 were dematerialized in February of 2018. This is an aberration that must be fixed. We must restore Paul Bogle and what he represents to feature prominently on Jamaica's currency. Similarly, Madam Speaker, the coins on which Alexander Bustamante, and Norman Manley, and George William Gordon, and Marcus Garvey appear do not give visibility consistent with the original intent, Madam Speaker. Before we embarked on this wilderness path over 50 years. This too is an aberration that must be fixed. These heroes of Jamaica must be prominently restored on our banknotes, consistent with the original intent. As such, we will restore Alexander Bustamante, Norman Manley, George William Gordon, Paul Bogle, and Marcus Garvey to our banknotes, consistent with the original intent. When the Jamaican currency was first launched in the 60s, our heroes were prominently represented, with Sam Sharp joining in the 1980s on the $50 note. The fossils of our 5-decade experience of chronic macroeconomic stability, where our currency devalued by nearly 50,000%, is chiseled into the deformation of our currency and banknote design, where a noble original intent has dissolved, completely dissolved, and is no longer recognizable. Madam Speaker, young Edward Seaga, still in his 30s, had responsibility for the launch of Jamaica's own currency in the mid-1960s. In a seminal speech in 1965, and I want you to permit me to quote from him, he said, "The reason for representing our national heroes on our banknotes was that we would focus attention on our history." Further in that speech, he asked, and this is Mr. Seaga in his 30s in 1965, "But why should we look backwards over our shoulders to recognize the roles of those who went before the modern development of our history in 1938? He answered his question as follows, and Mr. Seaga continued, "A people who recognize their history recognize the role of those who went before them, in thought and in action, and understand to what extent those who went before them contributed to the things that they have achieved and enjoy today. If we do not understand this, and give credit where credit is due, we are likely to give credit where credit is not due. We are likely to give all the credit for achievement to foreign benefactors without understanding that our own people played a significant role in achieving our liberation and what we enjoy today. And when we do this, we are naturally led to believe and to be influenced that our people and our country, if we don't put this in, are not capable of achieving things for which we fight. But we must always look elsewhere for help, for assistance, and for leadership. So he was promoting a self-reliant culture, Madam Speaker. At the dawn of our nation, it was that kind of deliberate and thoughtful act to prominently place our national heroes on our banknotes and to give credit where credit is due, and also to remind ourselves of our capacity for self-determination, that we have agency as a people, that we can create the future we want, that we can be self-sufficient and not dependent on foreign powers for our basic needs. So, Madam Speaker, Mr. Siaga continued in 1965, still in his 30s. So the very first act, he said, is to understand that we have our leaders past and present, and understand that they together, past and present, achieved many of the things we enjoy today. And because they've achieved these things, we're a people capable of respect, capable of understanding our own potential, and therefore one who understands that the meaning of the word independent is that it is to be a body of people in a nation that can do for themselves that which needs to be done. History plays a vital role, an important role in the creation of our society, in its development and in its progression, and we represent history on our banknotes, Madam Speaker. So we have to upgrade our banknotes for the technical reasons given, and we have to introduce a $2,000 banknote. But the Jamaican project, Madam Speaker, in this regard, has drifted far from the original intent. As I said earlier, the national heroes no longer appear in the banknotes. And in this 60th year of independence, this aspect of the national project must be restored. If I may remind you, Madam Speaker, this is what our banknotes used to look like. Showing it to the camera first. Where Marcus Garvey was on the 50-cent banknote. Alexander Bustamante was on the $1 banknote. Paul Bogle was on the $2 banknote. Norman Manley was on the $5 banknote. George William Gordon was on the $10 banknote. And we even had Noel Nethersole of blessed memory. He was there for a time. Okay, so this was the original intent, Madam Speaker, where our heroes were represented in our banknotes so that we would know that we are people capable of respect. These people represent what we have achieved. And by honoring them, we honor those who served with them. Many people died on the gallows with Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. And we honor them by putting them on our banknotes. But over, Madam Speaker, the last 50 years, we drifted from that. Drifted, Madam Speaker. And today, this is what it looks like. We're all familiar with it. Where rightfully we have Sam Sharp and Donald Sangster and Nanny and Michael Manley and the right, most honorable Hugh Shearer. But this is not the Jamaican story. This is not our history. This is not a representation of who we are as a people. And we must restore the original intent. Along with recovery and reform, there must be restoration, Madam Speaker. So in this 60th year of independence, the national project must be restored. Our national heroes will again appear so that we can be constantly reminded, Madam Speaker, as Mr. Siaga said, give credit where it is due. Give credit where it is due. So, Madam Speaker, now here's the thing. We have 7 national heroes. We have 4 deceased prime ministers. But we have 6 banknotes. Let me say that again. 7 national heroes, 4 deceased prime ministers and 6 banknotes, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, $2,000, and $5,000. So we have to fit 11 onto 6 notes, which means well, we have to have 2 faces per note. And leaders should appear in chronological order, subject to no leader being on a banknote of lower denomination than he or she was before. So, Madam Speaker, in the newly designed banknotes, the Right Excellent Paul Bogle and the Right Excellent George William Gordon, who were on Jamaica's original banknotes, but who today are on none of our banknotes, will be restored and appear together on the upgraded $50 note, Madam Speaker. United in the struggle for freedom, united in their sacrifice and unjust execution, those who sacrificed with them will be honored by their presence on our notes. The Right Excellent Marcus Garvey, who was on Jamaica's 50-cent banknote, but who is on no banknote today, will be restored and will appear alone on the upgraded $100 banknote. Madam Speaker, the Right Excellent Nanny of the Maroons and the Right Excellent Sam Sharp will appear together on the upgraded $500 note. Madam Speaker, the Right Excellent Sir Alexander Bustamante and the Right Excellent Norman Manley, who were founding fathers of modern Jamaica and who were contemporaries, serving over similar periods and rivals, who were on Jamaica's original banknotes, but are on none of our banknotes today, the Right Excellent Sir Alexander Bustamante and the Right Excellent Norman Manley will be restored and will appear together on the upgraded $1,000 banknote. Now, Madam Speaker, Jamaica went through a near civil war experience in the 1970s that deeply scarred the national consciousness. Electoral contests became overtly violent in nature. Remarkably, through great civil and society and political leadership, our country stepped back from the brink and reformed itself. However, not all the scars of this period have healed. Persons active in that era are still with us. Families who lost loved ones, who were displaced, who lost homes and jobs due to conflict, are still with us. They remember. They hurt. And in many cases, those wounds and those feelings run deep. Madam Speaker, we validate those experiences wherever they exist as authentic and sincere. But, Madam Speaker, are we to construct our affairs today in a manner that perpetuates this hurt and bequeaths unto future generations strife and division? Or are we to seek constructive, real and symbolic ways of forging unity and peace and love, of which our great philosophers, prophets, and artists advocate? The latter path has to be the way. We must restore unity in our society. Our symbolism must not seed division. Instead, it should forge unity and lift us up in the process. That has been the message of Prime Minister Andrew Holness from his first speech as Prime Minister in 2011, when he spoke about the de-garrisonization of the mind. Therefore, Madam Speaker, with the backing of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet of Jamaica, and with the consent of the representatives of the families who are authorized to give this consent, of the Most Honourable Michael Manley and the Most Honourable Edward Seaga, we are therefore pleased that the Most Honourable Michael Manley and the Most Honourable Edward Seaga, who are contemporaries and rivals, will appear together on the new $2,000 banknote. Speaker, our country first of all, we're thankful to the families, the legal representatives of who consented to this. Our country must move forward, Madam Speaker. I can show a preview. This is what the notes have to be distinct in color so we can easily distinguish them. Most of the features, most of the note is taken up in security features on the left and on the right. We have all the leaders appear on a note on a higher currency, higher denomination than they were before, and the photographs that appear are the same photographs that we have today, because getting permission to change all those photographs would have been, so the photographs are the same, and Madam Speaker, we expect later this year for these to be in circulation, and they'll last 50% longer than existing banknotes. So do you know those notes that, like the notes in the UK, that cannot get right? Moving forward. So, Madam Speaker, our country must move forward, and move forward in unity, peace and love. Jamaica's average income today is less in real terms than it was 50 years ago. Madam Speaker, there's a mountain top we must climb where fruit and honey lie, but we can only get there by climbing together. Madam Speaker, there are those no, I just want to say, peace and love, Madam Speaker. Peace and love. Peace and love, Madam Speaker. And collocating images of great leaders on our banknotes doesn't deny anyone their unique contribution or their unique identity, and it doesn't shield them from the full introspection of history. And Madam Speaker, I say if I can speak here now as not as Minister of Finance, but as a member of a party, I speak to my fellow Labourites, Madam Speaker, and I say the biggest respect that we can show, because some people would say, is by following the ideas of those we want to show respect to. It is ideas, and not the placement of images, that last the test of time. We don't really know what Moses of the Old Testament looks like. We don't really know. All we have are sketches. But we remember the 10 Commandments that he shared 4,000 years ago. It's ideas that matter. And it was Mr. Siaga's idea to have national heroes on our banknotes, Madam Speaker. And we honor him by restoring that vision. Finally, Madam Speaker, the Most Honourable Donald Sangster and the Most Honourable Hugh Shearer will appear together on the upgraded $5,000 note. These leaders presided over the period of greatest economic expansion in Jamaica's history. The government, Madam Speaker, we're about recovery, reform, restoration. We're restoring our heroes, and we are aiming to restore unity to our country, Madam Speaker. We can compete, but we can be unified. The Bank of Jamaica will be holding sensitization sessions so that new security features can be understood, and the visually impaired community can be familiar with those features. Now, Madam Speaker, I move on to the last segment of my presentation, Madam Speaker, which is on the Zoom. All right, so Madam Speaker. It's here, though. It's here. Oh, no. So, Madam Speaker, moving on to, it's so small, I couldn't find it. Madam Speaker, I used to the big, fat second one. But I couldn't find it, it was so small.
Those days of the big fat second one. Can't tell when last. When last have you heard the word tax?
Yeah, we don't. Right.
Minister,
So that
we
should tell you
can't follow
everything, Madam
it in his
Speaker.
booklet.
I want to turn my attention to revenue measures for the new fiscal year. And I'm pleased to begin my remarks by informing the people of Jamaica that there will be no new taxes. No new taxes, Madam Speaker. We are prioritizing economic recovery. We want to achieve economic recovery in the quickest possible time. Increasing taxes at this time would run counter to that objective. Madam Speaker, this is the 7th consecutive fiscal year. 7th. Where on a net basis we have not raised taxes. And the 5th consecutive year where there's absolutely no new taxes, Madam Speaker. No, Madam Speaker, yesterday oil prices hit the highest level in more than a decade due to developments related to the war in Ukraine. Though we know this will be temporary, this appreciation in the price of oil has a negative impact on Jamaica and Jamaican consumers in the meantime. There are several persons, including those, some people in opposition, who have advocated for a removal of all of the, or part of the special consumption tax of $7 per litre that was placed on petrol by the previous administration in March 2015. Madam Speaker, I ask Jamaicans to first consider the facts. We can't argue facts. I'm going to lay out some facts. By way of background, in his budget presentation in March 2015, the then Finance Minister, Dr. Peter Phillips, proposed a hedge on the price of oil and then announced the imposition of a $7 per litre tax on petrol, which was to yield $6.4 billion in order to pay for the hedge and to compensate for the loss of revenues in the lower price of oil. People forget that part of the presentation. The revenue measures tabled in the financial year 2015-16, contained in Ministry Paper 3415, tabled in the House on the same day, included the following sentences. I want you to listen to the sentences. This is what was tabled in the House. I have a copy of it here. You can share it with anybody who wants. It said, House members are being asked to note that the systematic reduction in oil prices has had an adverse impact on government revenues, because up until then, the predominant was the ad valorem method. The loss has been significant, and the government has noted the need to insure against future contingencies. That was in the revenue measures, i.e., the revenue measures in 2015-16 noted that the government was earning less because oil prices had gone down, and they needed to find a way to make it back up. In his budget presentation on the same day, the then Minister of Finance proposed a hedge on the price of oil, and then announced the imposition of $7 per litre on petrol to pay for the hedge and to compensate for revenue loss. The new tax, as I said, was $6.4 billion. During the 2015-16 fiscal year, $3.3 billion was paid to overseas bankers for a series of hedging contracts that covered 8 million barrels of oil over an 18-month period. Jamaica's consumption of oil over that 18-month period was 24 million barrels. Though they spent, so, Madam Speaker, the first fact I want you to remember is that the government of the day pursued hedging contracts up to June of 2015. You remember they were in office for all the rest of 2015 and the beginning of 2016. That 11 months in 2015-16. But they only used 3.3 billion of the 6.4 billion in a hedge, not the full amount. In addition, Madam Speaker, there was no separate fund. All the proceeds went to the consolidated fund. The contracts all expired worthless. And another thing to remember is that even with that, all they managed to do was to buy some contracts that accounted for 1/3 of Jamaica's oil imports. It covered 8 million barrels over an 18-month period, and the volume over that 18 months was 24 million. Now, former Minister Phillips has often expressed understanding of the pressure that I face in my capacity as Minister of Finance, and I'm always grateful for it. Well, in the same vein, I can appreciate the pressures that he was under. And knowing what I know, but cannot say, but from the publicly available evidence, I'll offer my opinion that Minister Phillips needed to raise revenues, and I think that much is clear, needed to raise revenues for the budget, but given the volatility of gas taxes in Jamaica, 1986, 1999, he viewed it as a dangerous thing to do, and so it lent weight to the idea of a hedge in order to ease acceptance of the overall revenue measure. However, the reality is that the ministry paper sets out, tabled in this house, which I have a copy of, it speaks to, in the note that accompanies the 6.4 billion, speaks to significant loss of revenues that the ministry has to, you remember we're in an annual program, we have to meet the target at the end of the year. We had to raise revenues. But because, and this is not a good thing in our society, that we can have a rational discourse even when we need to, right? But because the thing was potentially volatile, the idea of the hedge eased the conversation, and it worked. But now it has created this thing because we have not been fully transparent about all of it. Since assuming power in 2016, this government has pursued a path of giving back hundreds of billions of taxes to the Jamaican people and not impose any new net tax. Rather than undo the so-called hedge tax, which I've established was not used solely for this purpose, we instead decided to raise the threshold from income tax, resulting in what we have today, where upwards of 350,000 people pay no income tax. Is we do that. Minister Shaw did that. That, Madam Speaker, was a give back of $30 billion per annum. Now, it was a revenue neutral measure, just to be very clear, that along with that $30 billion of personal income tax, there were revenue measures that raised a corresponding amount. But the fact is that people who paid income tax before did not pay it now. And if you know anybody who benefited from that, you talk to them about swapping, about taking away their income tax benefit and taking away, and at the same time taking away the other things that we increased. And every one of them will tell you, go away. Every one of the 330,000 people who benefited from it. Now, Madam Speaker, Jamaicans have been relieved of an aggregate $150 billion of personal income tax since we raised the threshold in 2017. At the same time, we increased social assistance by 50%. So rather than undo the gas tax, Madam Speaker, we instead decided later on in 2020 to give back in the form of an economic stimulus in response to the COVID pandemic, where we gave back $14 billion in the form of a reduction in GCT. Over the last 2 years, that give back is worth $28 billion. When the other side raise their voices, Madam Speaker, become heated and attempt to claim moral high ground on this issue, I want to ask a simple question. When have you given back taxes to the Jamaican people? Where is your give back? Where have you given back taxes on a net basis in any year that you've been in power? Find the year and tell me. It cannot be found. Madam Speaker, I believe you'll recall that in my presentation last year, I brought with me a glass house to accompany a warning about those who live in glass houses, Madam Speaker. I won't bring the house out again unless I'm forced to. But my warning remains. As Anthony Redrose says in his song, Temper. Never say me never did I warn you. A little of this, a little of that. All right. Madam Speaker, it is... Never say me never did I warn you, Marky G. Never say me never did I warn you, Marky G. No, Madam Speaker, it's also a fact that the price of unleaded petroleum has risen by 50% over 12 months. So the stuff I mentioned earlier, those are facts. But it's also a fact that unleaded petroleum has gone up by 50% in 12 months, and other categories have gone up as well. And the government recognizes that many Jamaicans are suffering from this significant increase in price. As such, Madam Speaker, we focus on the poor and vulnerable, Madam Speaker, and we will establish a special provision in the amount of $2 billion to target support to those who are most adversely affected and who have the least ability to absorb the impact of high gas and energy prices. We will come back on the details in terms of allocation because we want to discuss with stakeholders, get other people's views of how we should allocate it. But I can easily see some of it being used to provide some relief to taxi operators who have fixed fares, and some being used for children on path who have transportation costs and so forth. But we will come back with greater detail as to how we are going to allocate it, because we want to listen to stakeholders and understand, to optimize the best way of allocating it. So rather than give back and, the way that they want, and rich people with SUV and Land Cruiser and Prado benefit from it, and people who have 6 car and 10 car, who use the bulk of the fuel anyway, we are doing it in a targeted way, where the poor and the vulnerable can be targeted. And we will come to their assistance at this time, Madam Speaker, just like we did during COVID-19. Now, Madam Speaker, at the same time, we have to be strategic and think long-term. Having had such a dependence on oil for our energy needs, we recognize that this is a risk to our economic security. Look at what's happening today. No fault of our own. And there's no developed country, if you look carefully, as exposed to the price of oil as we are. None. Because they know that this is not a way to structure the economy. We must rid ourselves of this unhealthy dependence on oil. And I'm sure the PM and the Minister of Energy will speak to that more fulsomely in the future. A huge source of our oil import bill is for petroleum used by cars. However, technology exists today that allows us to reduce that dependence and reduce the operating cost to consumers. Electric vehicles, Madam Speaker, cost 1/3 of what petroleum-powered vehicles cost to fuel. 1/3. In other words, if it takes $10,000 to fill a car with petrol, it would cost $3,000 if the car was powered by electricity. This is so as using petrol as fuel wastes a lot of energy in the form of heat exhaust from the engine that is making the energy. Having more electric vehicles in Jamaica would allow us to have more renewable energy, as there's a synergy between renewable energy and intermittency. There's a synergy between the intermittency problem of renewable energy and the electric car's need for storage. Eventually, in a decade, motor vehicles in Jamaica, and this is the minister will speak more fulsomely about this, need to be 100% electric powered with energy from the sunshine.
But it's going to be inevitable.
This would...
Combustion engines are going to eventually be phased out.
As the Prime Minister is saying, combustion engines inevitably will be phased out. And this would rid us from this kind of price vulnerability that we have from the oil movements, which move on geopolitical events and other things that are unrelated to what's happening here in Jamaica. And consumers would be able to enjoy stable prices to operate their cars. Now, we cannot get there overnight, but we have to start. And Madam Speaker, for this reason, we want to start by incentivizing the purchase of electric vehicles as a strategic, longer-term response, and by reducing the import duty on electric motor vehicles from 30% to 10% for an initial 5-year period, and for exempting the annual registration fees on battery electric vehicles. Last year, the government earned only $27 million in duties on it from the importation of electric cars. This measure has a cost of $18 million, therefore, on current volumes. However, because duties on motor vehicles are so large and a huge part of government revenues, we will need to limit the number of electric vehicles being imported that benefit from this duty to in the first instance, 1,000 per annum. And we'll come with more details on how this will work. And this measure is to be implemented in the first quarter, and further details will be provided. So as we respond tactically with direct and targeted support for the poor and vulnerable, we must also respond strategically. And for the part of government I'm responsible for, which is the fiscal part, this is a strategic fiscal response to a long-term response to the crisis we face with the dependence on oil. I'm sure there will be other strategic responses from other ministries. So, Madam Speaker, in concluding, my remarks today have focused on the themes of recovery, reform, and restoration. Over the past 2 years, COVID cost $76 billion, including $40 billion direct costs I'm talking about, not indirect. Indirect far greater than that. And $40 billion of direct social and economic support, and we're all happy that our economy is now recovering. In terms of recovery, I'm proud to report to the people of Jamaica that despite the devastating impact of COVID-19, the Jamaican economy, we are recovering faster than some of our peers and recovering stronger. In the past year, Madam Speaker, we had quarterly economic growth of between 5.8 and 14%, which is the highest growth achieved in 50 years, albeit after a record contraction the year before. Every sector of the Jamaican economy is recovering, except for mining, which we expect to recover this year. The number of jobs have increased by over 100,000, resulting in unemployment at 7.1%. And despite having had to spend more to address the pandemic, and despite having our economy collapse in 2020, our debt to GDP ratio is on track to being lower at the end of this year than at any time in the last 22 years. This quick and strong recovery, Madam Speaker, did not occur by accident. In fact, Madam Speaker, over the past year, many countries of the world experienced a second year of economic decline. And in Jamaican history, we have had several years in which GDP growth has collapsed, not to be followed by recovery, but by additional years of decline. In the COVID crisis, Madam Speaker, we were not distracted by short-term, politically expedient demands, but instead remained focused and disciplined and acted, Madam Speaker, responsibly and thoughtfully and carefully and strategically. We pursued good policy, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, we are going to follow up recovery with reform. We're going to deepen financial inclusion with the creation of low-risk, less stringent, know-your-customer accounts, where you will pay no banking fees, Madam Speaker, and benefit from a deposit from the government of Jamaica if you are one of the first 100,000 after April 1st. We're going to deepen financial inclusion with central bank digital currency, Jamdex, where you can pay and transfer anytime, anywhere, with no bank fees. We're going to implement a new and modern efficient custom regime and revamp the tax system. We're going to strengthen governance and audit and oversight mechanisms to increase independence and engender greater trust among the public. We'll strengthen the capabilities of our public sector through continuing the Marcus Garvey Scholarship Program and put in place comprehensive pension reform to secure better pensions and allow workers to carry out their workers to carry their pensions with them if they leave their jobs. We'll implement the comprehensive public sector compensation restructuring to make our public sector compensation fairer, easier to understand, transparent, easily understood, sustainable, affordable, in a way that recognizes and rewards performance. Madam Speaker, we may not have a lot of resources, we may be poor, but we must be just. We will restore justice and internal equity to public sector compensation. We recognize, Madam Speaker, that these initiatives come at a significant cost and reduces room for error. But we believe in investing in our people and improving the quality and the capacity of the public sector. In terms of restoration, Madam Speaker, we remain committed to ensuring that we put Jamaica back on a path of sustainable economic growth from which we have meandered, so that Jamaicans are able to achieve the Jamaican dream. Here are some of the actions we have taken to accelerate this path. We launched the first catastrophe bond of any small island country in the world. We're investing $13 billion, a record, higher by at least 50% over the prior year, in loans and credit supports to MSMEs. We're investing $10 billion in private equity and venture capital to help early-stage companies and SMEs, and we're attracting $1 billion in integrated resorts developments to enhance and deepen our tourism project. We plan to come to market with, Madam Speaker, over $200 billion of infrastructure projects over the next 3 years. We're advancing on unemployment insurance for Jamaicans. And for the seventh consecutive year, we're not imposing any new taxes on the people of Jamaica, because we believe you're best positioned to decide how to spend your money. Madam Speaker, we're establishing $2 billion in provision to protect the most vulnerable Jamaicans and those least unable to absorb the impact of very high oil prices. As we speak, Madam Speaker, we are rolling out $200 million of support through Food for the Poor, through the International Red Cross, United Way, and other charitable organizations as we increase support for the vulnerable. We'll roll out $500 million more of food support starting in April, involving MPs and councillors, Madam Speaker. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, 100,000 Jamaicans who established low-risk KYC accounts after April 1 will benefit from a deposit of $22,500 from the government of Jamaica. We're implementing a new digital currency, Jamdex, which will bring the underbanked into the formal system and make doing business easier and cheaper. Up to 100,000 Jamaicans who, after April 1st, established Jamdex digital currency accounts will benefit from a deposit of $2,500 from the government of Jamaica. Finally, Madam Speaker, we will restore our national heroes to a place of pride on our banknotes. We will co-locate former rivals in an effort at restoring unity in our society. Madam Speaker, I'm grateful to my colleague minister and predecessor as Minister of Finance, Honourable Audley Shaw, who reminded me and several of our colleagues recently of how he closed a budget presentation a few years ago. With his permission, I feel compelled to follow him in quoting the passage from the Holy Book in Isaiah, chapter 58, verse 12. The Lord will always guide you. He will satisfy you in a sun-scorched land and strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins, and you will restore the age-old foundations. You, meaning we, will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets of dwelling. Madam Speaker, we are here to pursue recovery, to pursue ambitious reform, and to restore all that we love and value about Jamaica. Madam Speaker, may the Lord continue to guide us, and I believe sincerely that our people will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the age-old foundations, and we can collectively become the repairers of the breach, and we can collectively become the restorers of our dwelling Jamaica, land we love. Thank you, and God bless you.
Well done.
Yes, sir.
Madam Speaker, colleagues, the House is still in session.